take my word for things. And also, if a subject interests you, then you can take that away as a start for further reading. If you were to scroll all the way to the far right-hand side of the nest, you'll see that that is the invitation to today's space. But if you were to click on it, it opens the thread, and in the thread below is the agenda, or our reading list, essentially, that contains all the sources that I'm going to be using, when presenting the news. In that way, you can look ahead a little bit, and if any subject interests you, then if you develop a comment or a question when we get to that part of the conversation, then please come up and join us on the stage. You can always request a microphone by hitting the microphone button in the bottom left of the Spaces window. And if you're enjoying the conversation as we go along, then consider retweeting the space. That way we'll get as many new people in as we can. We always like to have more voices into the conversation. I think that's probably it for the intro. So in terms of timing, I am going to run through some resources, a couple of examples that I think were good from the last few days since our last space. And then we'll move into updates. We don't have a featured speaker today, although I know a few friends of ours have done some good research work, and we're hoping to have them come up and speak to that a little bit so you understand how their process works. I'm going to start at the far right-hand side of the nest. Again, that very first tweet on the right is the invitation to today's space with the reading list down thread. The second item back is the invitation to our next conversation. I hold these spaces every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern and every Thursday night at 9 p.m. The hope is to get some people on the North American West Coast on Thursdays by running later, and a few of our friends in Europe who are willing to stay up into the evening on our Sunday spaces. The third item back in the nest from the right is a reminder that friends of ours are live streaming our conversation to YouTube. I'd always encourage you to join us here because you can request the mic and contribute on Twitter. But if you miss a conversation and you'd like to watch it after the fact, or if there's some subject that we spoke to that you'd like to catch up on, you can always go to that YouTube channel that's linked in the tweet. The item in the middle of the nest at the moment is our calendar. We set this up because we have a couple of friends who host spaces, including our friends at Tochny and others, whether those spaces are about OSINT work or specifically the war in Ukraine. We also add outside events when there are great talks that are being put on, usually by think tanks and universities. If you click the link to it's the third-party app, Team Up, it will open the calendar in your web browser, and then the individual entries in the calendar will usually either have a registration link for upcoming events or a recording for those that have passed. If there are any events you see coming up you think would be of interest to our audience, our crowd, feel free to send them either to myself or to Jacoby, or I don't know if Planet Baroque is in the audience, but they help in running the calendar. They really do all the heavy lifting, so you can send it to one of us. There aren't a lot of fresh events to highlight this week. I did include podcasts here. So if you were to click on that tweet in the middle of the nest titled Calendar and Podcasts, the only two podcasts from the last few days I wanted to highlight. There was an interview that was done by John Spencer, who many of you know from the Ukraine spaces. And he recently had the opportunity to interview Sergeant Arseniy Fedoziuk, who was, a sergeant with the Azov Battalion as they defended the city of Mariupol. And I like this particular verse. So there is a link to the podcast in his tweet. I like this particular version of it because somebody has put together a helpful summary of some of the topics they discussed in the interview. So that way you get a sense of whether it will be interesting to you. And John does good work documenting the urban battles, particularly he's now had some chance to visit the sites of several of the battles from early in the war. And I understand he's working on profiles of those. So he's definitely writing the first draft of history. The one other podcast I wanted to highlight from the last few days is from our friend Andrew Perpetua, who we normally will highlight his maps anyway. And he will do a live stream to YouTube on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Time and Friday afternoons at 3 p.m. Eastern Time to be available to our European friends. And in that live stream, he'll screen share and he'll walk through his map and all the latest changes. So if you want the detailed how are things changing along the front, you can check that out. And so I've included in that calendar and podcasts the link to his most recent stream. There are a set of resources this week. So this is now it's the fourth back from the left. It's entitled Resources. There's one tool that I'm going to highlight. I'll move this to the front of the nest. This one caught my attention. I understand it's not a brand new tool, but it caught my attention because the creator of this tool, which is called Epios, I believe is the way to pronounce it. It is essentially a social media, scanning tool. So if you know the email address of someone, you can enter it in and find lots of their different social media accounts, usernames. You can get a sense of what, via the social media and other websites that that username has been logged in at. You can get a sense of hobbies, where they may be hanging out, as what would probably be a good first step in doing an overview of somebody you're trying to look into. The author of the tool took this opportunity of the recent assassination of that former Russian submarine commander, where it was noted that his Strava fitness app appeared to have revealed his essentially real-time location while he was jogging on the morning that he was attacked. And he's using that to highlight, if you knew a subject's email address, you could have found out that they use Strava, because this tool would reveal that username is then used on the Strava site. So I thought that was, a good way to tie into current events. So that's the one tool. There are two or three sort of philosophical things. I like to add these angles from time to time. I'm moving to the front of the nest a tweet by Shashank Joshi, who is the defense editor at The Economist. And he's highlighting a new article from the Financial Times about the risks and the rewards of trying to use AI as a spy. And this is playing on a theme we've discussed in the space a few times. Last week, the head of UK intelligence included in his remarks notes about how AI is very unlikely to replace human analysts in intelligence. And we've had some discussions about efforts to adapt AI tools for use in OSINT or analysis generally, including Bellingcat attempting to use AI for the purposes of geolocation. So if you have a look back in my speaking notes for these spaces, you can find a lot of those materials. The last set of sort of philosophical thoughts is just a note. We previously, I think it was only on Thursday, that Twitter changed the rules around direct messaging so that you will not receive DMs from unverified accounts that you don't follow by default. Everybody, regardless of your prior settings, everybody's default was switched back to you can receive essentially unsolicited, because you don't follow, DMs from verified accounts, but you cannot from unverified by default. So if you're doing work where you get tips from people, and I know just because I hold these talks, I do get tips from unverified accounts, and I know several of you do as well, you need to set that default back. This latest change this week, and it was highlighted both by Oliver Alexander and also by Oryx, and I suspect it would affect just about everybody who gets good tips from the general population. Noted that unverified accounts, so the non-Twitter Blue accounts, now are going to have a limit on how many DMs they can share. And Oliver Alexander in his thread noted that he sent 92 DMs in one day, and that was it. And he was limited on DMs. And he's essentially saying, in the middle of a crisis, where you may be communicating with many people, you can hit that limit very quickly. And even if you're the person who wants to collect the information and you can buy Blue, to control your own situation, many of those who are contributing to you might not want to pay the subscription fee. And if they've used up their allocated messages for the day, that's a bunch of tips that you may never receive that you would have otherwise, which is unfortunate. But it's something to keep in mind. In that way, I've had some conversations with some folks who are friends of ours, and talked about the idea of including your Signal contact information in your bio here on Twitter. I've seen several journalists do that, particularly those who cover national security and defense matters, essentially to say, if you'd like to contact me anonymously, you can do it using Signal, where the advantage is the encryption. But more than that, if people are now DM limited on Twitter, if they bump into that limit, they still might be willing to reach out to you on some other platform like Signal. So consider whether it's worth it to you to set up a Signal account using some sort of private phone number, whether it's from one of the Google phone plans or otherwise, to keep your personal details private, and then put it in your bio. I do have Signal, but I haven't set one up yet with a private phone number, so I should probably follow my own advice and do the same. Moving along in the nest, it's now, what is it? It's about in the middle. It's the 6th from the right. These are good examples from the last few days. And I'm going to highlight one or two that are from friends of ours. I think before getting to our friends who are speakers, I'm going to highlight a set of material that relates just to one strike that happened, I think, yesterday in Crimea. I'm just putting the material in the nest now. This was the strike on the Oktyabrskoye air base in Crimea. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is it's essentially the chain of different types of imagery or different sourcing with regard to an event. And you'll see that a lot of the regular suspects of OSINT accounts are included here. But you can see sort of from first detection through obtaining firsthand video, how the process works, and how some people put it together, but they don't include every element. And so if you're trying to build a thread with regard to an event, I would highlight this set of materials that's in the nest now as a sort of a template for how to build out a thread to cover as many angles as possible. So if you were to scroll to the front of the nest, the first tweet is by Malcontent News. And you'll see that he refers to the firm's data. And I think that with many of these strikes, particularly the larger explosions, depots, oil storage locations and the like, they first come to people's attention via firms. So it's a good one to keep an eye on. There are caveats that not every single point on firms that comes up is necessarily a fire or necessarily a significant strike, but it's sort of scanning for the target environment of interesting spots. At this point, I thought I'd also ask a question of my co-host Radio and Nukes, who Radio and Nukes, I don't know if you've put up a post about it, but I saw in a chat that we're in that you found a new script in order to sort of emulate firms on one of the satellite imagery providers. Do you have can you explain how that works? Yeah. And let us know if you put up a post about it.
Yeah, I did. I sent out a tweet. I'll dig it up after this and we can throw it in the nest. But essentially, if you've used the EO browser for Sentinel 2 or 3 data, which a lot of people have used, under visualization, there's a custom button, and then you can click custom script, and it'll let you put a custom script in there to change how the visualization works. And I found in the Sentinel Hub, I guess this is the custom scripts-sentinelhub.com. So it's their custom script repository that they have high accuracy fire point detection for Sentinel-3, and they also have one for Sentinel-2. And basically, it just messes with it changes how the different optical bands are viewed and highlights the energy output from fires. It actually seems to work pretty good. Of course, it's limited to each path. So if you want to give that a look, it's pretty easy. You just copy and paste the script in there and then click refresh script at the bottom, and it works. So.
Well, it's pretty cool that they have that option for essentially like plugins, which is great. Have you had much opportunity to explore the other plugins? Like, as in, do you think there are untapped resources to find out there, or have you had a pretty good look at this point?
Definitely. I haven't had a big look. I have done the ocean object detection using Sentinel-1, and it works pretty good to see, it'll make ships stand out a little better. And I've tried a few other ones that were agriculturally related just to see if they would show anything, and they didn't really do anything on the OSINT side, at least what I'm looking for. But there are hundreds of different scripts in here, and I would say anybody that's using EO Hub should have a look at them.
So just before going to exit, one more question for radio is, I haven't had enough time to explore it. What do you think the accuracy of detection is with Sentinel versus firms? Have you had an opportunity to try to cross-reference what the two are presenting?
Well, so the Sentinel-3 is going to be very similar to what you get from the NOAA 2021 and the Sumoi satellite that the U.S. uses. They're in a similar orbit. Now, the Sentinel-2 data, that's a 10-meter resolution versus 375 or 500 meters. So the accuracy is a lot better. However, I've not had a big issue finding anything with firms. I mean, I typically look at a firm spot and then immediately go to the Sentinel-2 data after, if the time works out to where the Sentinel-2 data is newer. So the accuracy is better. It seems like the detection threshold may not be quite as good using the Sentinel data that I've looked at so far. It seems like there may be a few more false positives, but I imagine that script could be, if somebody in here knows JavaScript and satellite imagery, it could be refined a little bit to pick out more for what we're looking for and maybe ignore some of the, random hotspots and things.
If nothing else, it is good for corroboration by having a double check. Yeah, and if anybody listening is the sort of person who could either develop or revise scripts for Sentinel Hub, first of all, if you let us know, that would be great. And if you can, maybe we can put our heads together. So some of the folks who do a lot of the imagery analysis might have good suggestions for ways to script out some things to make detections faster, not just a fire, but other sorts of objects. Exit, go ahead.
I was just going to take a second to say that I put Radio Nukes' thread about that up in the nest, and you can find it there. And I'll just remind everybody else, if you're new here, the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a little button that takes you to the tweet for the space. You can tweet that out so that other people come in and chat with us. But also, underneath that, I'll be sharing all of the tweets that go up in the nest down into that tweet. And so through the week, if you're looking for some of these resources again, you can look there and maybe bookmark that, and that you'll be able to find it easily.
Thanks for that. So in this sort of theme I'm trying to set out, the first example is Malcontent News. With this particular strike on the airfield, he looked at firms. So he posted the firms data. If you look at the third item in the nest, Benjamin Patet, who many of you probably know as Kupcher, he went to Telegram and he found different angles of ground footage of, the dust cloud of the explosion, the smoke of the explosion. And the thing I like about this is he posts the whole video, and he also posts a link to the Telegram channels from which he got the video, which I think is very important to have that sourcing. And then you'll see, if you have a look at the fourth item back in the nest, the account Tendar also posted about it. In his case, he did some things that were helpful. So he included the source for the Telegram video. He also got older satellite imagery of the airfield, so you could see what it looked like. That way, if you were trying to find it for yourself in Google Earth or in satellite imagery, you're a little further ahead. He included the Latin Long. It's geolocated pretty readily because of the airfields are all known. In some cases, those videos, like Kupshur posted, having multiple angles on it would help you to, if you can geolocate the direction that the filming is occurring in, you can sort of triangulate by crossing the direction of the video, for subjects that aren't as easy to geo. And then included by Tendar in his tweet, he overlaid on the older satellite imagery a little inset of the location in Crimea, which I thought was helpful because then it puts it in context. So I like that tweet as it's slowly bringing things together, right? We have satellite imagery, ground video, geolocation, and source to the video. If he had added firms in there, then we would have accumulated everything so far. The fifth item back in the nest, it's the last in this theme, is a tweet from our Japanese friend who does a ton of imagery analysis. And in this case, I'm taking this as an example of recent imagery for battle damage assessment purposes. In this case, all it shows is smoke. So it's additional verification through, the visual, the optical spectrum, that you can definitely see something was hit. But because the smoke is in the way, you can't actually evaluate the level of damage yet. And so I'm pointing these various ways of approaching imagery out to say, if you were building a thread, if you can incorporate as many of these elements as possible, then it's a comprehensive story. And obviously, depending on how breaking it is, you can only collect so many of these. But it's an encouragement to try to get as many of those together as possible. And it is good when multiple accounts contribute to a story, as in one person gets BDA, one person gets ground footage, but often they're separate. And so if you're not following all the accounts together, you don't see presented in one place. So I wanted to walk through that set of details to include and to say, it slowly builds up with time. All of these accounts are great. This is not a criticism of any of them. Some of the posts of these folks were made before the subsequent bits of information were available, but in this way to highlight, hey, if you're putting it together, try and grab as many of these as you can. Okay, I will run through two more interesting examples from the last few days. These two other examples were from friends of ours. So we just spoke with Radio and Nukes, so I'll save his for a moment. But there was an interesting bit of work done by OSINT-Schizo, OSINT Miskif, who's a regular friend of ours, comes up to chat a fair bit, who wrote about the Russian attack on the Chudniv artillery depot. Schizo, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me come up.
Do you want to just describe to the audience why you thought this particular strike was worth highlighting, and then some of the steps you went through to uncover the story that you discovered?
Yeah, so the thing that perked my interest was the timing of when we started seeing information come out about it. So at this point, it was a few days ago. It was early afternoon, maybe like 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and out of nowhere, like it was like the floodgates opened. Every pro-Russian channel was being like, look at this big explosion. You know, Ukraine's got to go to the negotiating table, big explosion. They all were posting the same video from the same source. And I was like, okay, like, it's a big explosion. Let's see where it is. What is it? And then they started talking about like, oh, all the cluster munitions were blown up. And it's like, okay, I've seen this before. Everyone's seen this before with Pavrahad chemical plant and Kelminsky. And so I was like, oh, it's probably another one of these Soviet-era munition dumps that Ukraine has a lot of. They're not a secret. Everyone knows where they are. And so I just decided to do digging to see where the site was, geolocate it, and see if it was on any of the list of Soviet munition sites, or if it had connections to the disarmament and denuclearization programs that Ukraine was a part of in the late 90s and early 2000s. I kind of just started going down that historical paper trail.
I saw that you had suggested that because Russia has hit some of the previously the storage sites for unused or rocket stages that are being held pending disassembly, and that you seem to be suggesting that maybe Russia is spreading these attacks out. Given they know their location, they're holding them for PR purposes. Do you think that's what they're doing?
I think that's most likely what they're doing. Just in the past few months, I'll highlight Kelminsky and Pavrahad. There was another one last year, I think, along the Dnipro. Each time they hit one of these old sites, they go on a whole narrative about how Ukraine's military is toast, right? So like Kelminsky, they were like, oh, all the depleted uranium from the British was being stored here, and now there's radiation spreading across Ukraine and spreading across Europe. The end is nigh. And with Pavrahad, they said that they destroyed all the S-300s. There was like a giant train with like 2 brigades worth of S-300 launchers and missiles, and that it was blown to the high heaven. And they pretty much point at the video and be like, but look how big the explosion is. It's like a little mushroom cloud, fireball half a kilometer wide. Like we did it, boys, war's over. And they kind of started doing the same thing with this particular depot. And it's like, okay, they want to form a narrative among their audiences. They've done it before. And it just kind of looks like they're continuing that trend.
I think Mr. Bond's mic might have gone out for just a second. Schizo, was there anything in particular in this search that you did different from some of the ones that you've done in the past that maybe you found it in a new way or found new information that you weren't expecting to find? Or was this pretty normal considering all the other ones that you've looked at?
Yeah, so initially, this one was mislocated originally. So originally the video was kept being tagged as, I can never get the pronunciation right. I was like Zotomir. And so I was like looking up around this town, seeing like, is there any depots? Like what is around this town? And I found 2 small airfields. And I was like, okay, maybe it's one of the depots for this airfield. And then I expanded my search because I know with Kelminsky, the unit that was attached to is an aviation munitions depot, but the airfield that it was attached to was 60 kilometers away. So I was like, all right, time to expand the search since there's 2 airfields around here. If it's another aviation munitions depot, see if anything pops up. And then I went through, there's a big report that I referenced from 2005, which pulls from a NATO document. I've not been able to find the original NATO document from the early 2000s, but they cited it in that, and it has a list of all the old depots that had munitions slated for disposal that never ended up panning out, and pretty much then use that to be like, okay, which depots are closest to where the videos are being tagged to, and then was able to find it that way.
Radio Nukes, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit in there because I searched around a little bit for the same site. It's really important that anybody that looks these things up, especially when they come with just a city name or a town name or an air base name, to remember most of the names that we get in English have been phonetically translated. And when you type those into Google, I'd say maybe 50% of the time, if they're not a major city, it gets it wrong. So be careful about that, because that's caught all of us so many times.
Yeah, that's a good point. This particular site, so like if you type in, like Shouldniv Munitions Depot, you'll find a declassified CIA report from 1964 on this particular site, and it's spelled completely differently. And it's also spelled differently in the BIC report as well. So there's 3 different spellings for this particular depot that are out there.
And of course, we've all run into the problems in Ukraine with the same name being reused. Exit. I was wondering how many ports are there named Chernomorsk?
I don't know them all yet, but I know at least 5 of them. Nope, 6. I know 6 of them.
Right. Schizo, you mentioned those older reports that show the ammunition depot locations. Have you taken a few minutes to look ahead to see whether there are any other depots that are likely to exist, in range, as in if the Russians are going to hit some more of these, what sites might be at risk now?
I need to go back and look at the full list, but there's about like almost 40 of these sites across all of Ukraine. Almost all of them are within range, whether it's of Russia firing a missile or even Ukraine now with storm shadows. They have the ability to strike some of the depots that are in Crimea.
So that's a fair point. It hadn't occurred to me that Ukraine could be targeting these as well. If Russia is striking at some of these old depots where the munitions are essentially just waiting disposal, and I understand in many cases they weren't disposed of just because of the cost. I don't know that Ukraine would do it for PR purposes in the way that Russia does. Do you think there would be any advantage to Ukraine in striking some of these depot locations in Russian-controlled territory?
I think there would be. So, like, some of the depots in Crimea are a little different in terms of what they hold. So a lot of the other depots have like small arms, artillery, parts for ICBMs that were dismantled. The ones in Crimea primarily hold torpedoes and sea mines. So from, like, say, a maritime security, protect the Black Sea from Russian mining, those depots would be a good target. Blow up these sea mines to prevent Russia from deploying them against the broader Black Sea region.
Okay, well, we'll have to keep our eyes on to see whether Russia or Ukraine follow up on any more of these sites. But that's interesting. Did you? I apologize for not recalling. Did you post links to any of those reports in your threads on this?
In the one that I posted the other day that you put in the nest, I did put the full title of it, and I think in the comments someone asked about the report, and so I responded in the comments with a direct link to the PDF.
Perfect. So if anybody listening is interested in having a look at where those sites are and trying to anticipate if this repeats, what some of the potential targets are, you can have a look at Schizo thread and go and find the report. Any other points on this, Schizo? Or, I think it was a cool bit of research. Was there anything you wanted to add we didn't get to?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of a lot of these depots, not all of them. So if you are using the BIC report, even that does not have a full comprehensive list. Those were only depots that still existed by 2005, or ones that had specific munitions at the time that were slated for decommissioning. So like Kelmitsky, there used to be upwards of 10 depots within a 50-kilometer radius of that particular depot. And a lot of them have just kind of been forgotten about. Some of them, like you can look at local media reports, it's like true horror stories. There's been like half a dozen incidences where these depots have just randomly exploded due to poor storage. Other depots, they took bulldozers with the munitions still inside and just demolished the buildings and called it a day. So even the report from 2005, that's only official depots that they had said, we want these particular munitions disposed of. Please help us with the funding. And that never went through.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Radio Nukes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to do a quick little comment. I don't know if you were headed there or not, but we did get a satellite image of this site to verify that that was exactly where the explosion took place, and the evidence is quite clear on the satellite imagery. It was a pretty massive blast. I just wanted to put out there that I crowdsource these images, and I do, if I see something like what Schizo had here that would benefit the whole community, I think it's worth going just a little bit outside of my niche at looking mainly at air defense assets to verify some of this stuff. So if anybody has a hot lead on something, let me know, and we can find the right resources to hopefully verify it.
Well, that's great. That's the kind of collaboration we want to inspire. Gurney, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to say thanks. That's a really good research thread there from both of you. My question in terms of how you come to the analysis of maybe the effects of this, the forward-looking effects, how do you rule out in the analysis here? How do you rule out what may have changed at those sites in the last 2 years, or what may not have changed in those sites? And I'm just asking it from the perspective of if these sites have multiple purposes of storing ammunition, what sorts of things can you rule out and say, no, this wasn't moved, or just sort of what sort of primary evidence you have just to take a forward look at that and say, this doesn't have bearing on Ukraine's ammunition, or does have bearing on it? I just wanted to understand that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So with a lot of these depots that were listed in 2005, again, the list of the depots and what was being stored at them, even almost 20 years ago at this point, they were saying these munitions are obsolete, they're dangerous, we cannot use them, we want to get rid of them. And they've been sitting there. You can also try and dig up news reports to see where explosions at some of these depots have taken place due to the poor storage, like Kelmitsky. They had an incident about a decade ago where part of the depot exploded due to the storage, and you can find, I'll keep using Kelmitsky because I haven't been able to find as much videos on this particular depot. I shouldn't have. You could find out news reports say, like with Kelmitsky, like there's a YouTube video from like 2012 of a local getting a tour. It was like partly a museum because they weren't really using it. So they had some of the bombs on display being like, hey, here's what these bombs were. Here's the history of this particular depot in relation to Soviet air forces and missile forces during the Cold War. And you can also see in the video like how they were storing it. Like the bombs were just sitting in the open with like trees growing out from them and little pieces of like tarp on other piles to try and keep it somewhat stored. Shouldn't have. I just used Sentinel and I just pretty much kept going back at every single satellite pass over that depot to see if there have been any obvious signs of activity. I couldn't see anything. There's no parking lot. There's no buildings near it for any sort of activity. There's a railroad that runs right next to it, but there's nothing at this particular depot to show that it's actively being used in any capacity. Was just sitting there, existed with all of these munitions that they couldn't use in a safe manner.
We'll go to radio and nukes and then exit. Go ahead, radio.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I was going to add the part that Skizzo said at the end with the satellite imagery, but I can make, we have access to be able to make long animated GIFs or movies of a site over time. And I tend to look at the vegetation and the upkeep. They tend to stand out pretty clearly once you've looked at this stuff for a little while, if they're in use or not. Is that verifiable 100% without a doubt? No, but it's just one of those things you kind of get used to after looking at these sites.
Thanks for that. Exit, go ahead.
So I guess my question was, if, for instance, you're an OSINT type person who's sitting around, maybe new to OSINT, and you want to try out your skills on something that could have skills or could have meaning in the future, would it be worth starting to identify some of these places, make a list of them, and start kind of tracking changes at these places so that if they ever are hit, for instance, you already have a background of knowledge about that?
Might not be a bad idea. Maybe like the ones in Crimea, since the Russians have occupied it since 2014, and they moved their military back onto these old bases. Might be interesting to see if those depots are actually being utilized, or if these depots are just kind of also just sitting there and they built a new depot somewhere else. The rest of them, fairly low likelihood that any of the rest of them are being used. The Ukrainian Army and Ministry of Defense have for a long time been asking for aid in assisting with disposal of these munitions. That's never really come. The closest was NATO did, I think it was like the Trust Fund program, and they helped dispose of a portion of the several million PMF or 3 anti-personnel landmines. But otherwise, the rest of these depots just continue to sit there idly, not really being used, and the munitions are too unstable to be used. You look at that big report from 2005, it lists the quantities and the caliber and tonnage, and it also goes into like what type of explosive mix. All these depots have stuff in particular, like Shouldn't had a bunch of artillery from type 1937 howitzers from pre-World War II shells that were mixed with TNT and RDX. Like, that's not a very stable compound in terms of aging, particularly when it's been in a depot that also hasn't really been maintained for 80 years. So like a lot of this stuff's just, no one's going to use it.
Exit, did you want to follow up?
Well, I guess I just put out the call there. If somebody wants to learn about how to do geolocation and kind of build this history of these sites, and they want somebody to check ideas around with, they're welcome to DM me, and I would be happy to. I don't have time for the work, but I'm happy to check ideas around with you and go forward with that.
Yeah, sort of along those lines, as friends of ours are getting more deeply into satellite work and imagery analysis, we're presenting some of these techniques. And I really do think that a lot of people who listen to us, would have the skill or the ability to do this type of work. It's just, the initial barriers, the hurdles to overcome in terms of signing up, being willing to actually pay some money for some satellite imagery. And so I was thinking briefly today about if you're somebody who's hearing this and you're interested, how do we help get people out and trying this? Because, it's not for everybody. I help out a little bit. I don't do it in a dedicated way like some of our other speakers do. Part of the issue is we have some groups who will compare notes, but if one individual is pulling down satellite imagery and they may be sharing it in a small group for the purpose of bouncing ideas around, you want to be careful because, there are copyright concerns and it may be some interesting subject and you don't want to get scooped in, the hour before you can put your analysis together. So it's not easy to simply add people who are interested, but if you're not prepared to go out and be paying money for your own imagery, like if you can, that's great. If you can't, or prefer not to, if you can, be contributing or commenting or, just so that we can get to know people a little bit. That's how we build relationships and create opportunities to kind of, if you demonstrate you have an interest and slowly have a chance to demonstrate that you have some analysis ability, particularly if you have a history of some people we know, for example, are former air defense folks, or they may actually have been in intelligence and they already can demonstrate they have these skills, then we'll build that relationship up and hopefully bring more people on. Radio and Nukes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat as Exit as far as time, but I would certainly be willing to help somebody with the tools, some of the services, whatever they need. I mean, like you said, it's hard to just randomly add new people to a group because there's a lot of issues there. But as far as anybody that needs help or wants to know where to get started, or if they've done a project and they want just somebody to review it, DM me. I'm available for that whenever. It may take me some time to get back to you, but I would certainly do what I can to, inspire more people to get into this kind of work.
Yeah, I think there are a lot among us who are happy to work with people. So that's kind of the broad message is whoever you reach out to on the panel, Exit, Radio, and Nukes, myself, all of the above. We are hoping to build, bigger teams. It's just a matter of some of it takes getting to know folks. Go ahead, Planet.
Hi there. I was just wondering, obviously there are degrees of getting involved in doing these things. There'd be sort of just having a dabble and then there'd be completely obsessed. But can someone give me an idea of what sort of price or the financial investment required to get involved, or to buy the adequate access to the adequate satellite stuff?
So I would be pretty positive Radio and Nukes has the best handle on that at the moment, and I suspect he'll give us some specifics, but it also varies on what kind of satellite you want access to, what kind of imagery you need, whether you have to get it from the archive or schedule fresh footage from a pass. Those are all variables. But Radio, can you fill us in on more detail?
Yeah, so that can be a tricky question at times for people. For me, using Skywatch right now, it's not a problem, but I am trying to work with Planet directly. And, a lot of times you can't disclose those numbers, but it depends. If you just want the 3-meter planet scope imagery, I paid 65 cents for an image earlier of a site. Now, it's not very great, but it is pretty useful to see if a strike had happened. That was the type of imagery that we looked at the ammo depot with. The high-res stuff tends to be a little more. You're probably looking, if you're going to pull it from the archive, $20 to $30 for an image, depending on how big it is. I mean, you're not going to go and get a whole air base or something at high-res unless you really need to, because you're probably looking at $250 to $300 for that area. It's price per square kilometer. And there are minimums, and see, the very high resolution imagery is the best stuff that Skywatch has right now. It tends to be about double what the high resolution is. So your typical, looking at an attack or an air defense area may be $60 to $100. But then it comes back to, some of these accounts are doing tasking, and that can go just through the roof. I mean, tasking can be $5,000 an image at times. Not always, but it just depends on what asset you want to get. And that's where you actually give the satellite service a latitude and longitude, and they actually aim the satellite and take a picture of that site for you. So everything I do so far has been out of the archive because I don't have the money for tasking. To be straight honest about that one. Hopefully that gives you some idea. I mean, it's not, especially if you're going to use planet scope imagery, it's not that bad.
So we'll go to Planet for follow-up, and then to Schizo. Go ahead, Planet.
Yeah, so there's not, I kind of envisaged that there would be subscription plans of some sort with a sort of a per month or opportunity to purchase for the year sort of thing to access certain things, services. Is that not the case?
I'll take that real quick. So it depends what you're going to do. So like the Sentinel EO Hub, if you want to use it, it's like 30, I guess it's euros a month for the non-commercial imagery and 100 for the commercial imagery. And that, again, with all of this stuff, if you're going to post it online, be very, very, very careful. You'll notice that I have slowed down lately, and that I'm kind of pursuing other options besides Skywatch because of this. So just be careful that you read the terms of service, the end user license agreements and everything closely, and maybe even, ask somebody in your jurisdiction that knows legalese on some of that, because it is a complicated, there's a lot more to it than just downloading the image and posting it online. There's attribution requirements and all kinds of stuff. But would you get into the larger contracts? I just don't know yet because I'm not there. But next week, hopefully we'll know, and maybe I can have some more information. But it's quite possible that I'll have to sign an NDA, so I may not be able to disclose that information.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot.
So we'll all know if Nuke shut up that that's exactly what happened. Schizo, you had your hand up for just a second there? Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of like the price point, it's really a scale. Like I usually just use Sentinel 2, and I've never had to pay for it. That's just like I just have like the free account, so like you don't get everything. There's like features and stuff like that that you can't use. So it's kind of one of those where it depends on how much money you're willing to put up for these various different imagery options that are out on the market. If you have the free account, obviously you're not going to get the greatest imagery. There's going to be features that are restricted, which kind of limits what you can do. Versus if you want like that high quality resolution, there's all kinds of price points and terms and stuff.
Radio, did you want to go ahead, and then we'll go to Woke?
Yeah, just real quick I forgot to mention that because that's a good point. So you can use the Sentinel EO Hub for free, and there's actually a thing called Copernicus Open Data Access where you can get the full resolution Sentinel 2, 1 and 2 imagery, but it comes as a special kind of file, and you have to use a tool called Snap to work with it, or QGIS, so it gets a little complicated. But the EO browser is out there. I haven't really looked at the free terms of service, but just be careful with it. It seems like everybody seems to be posting the imagery, but that means really nothing, if that's right or wrong. But I want to say that the Sentinel-2 data, that's my go-to first. I look at that before we buy anything, because a lot of times you can verify a strike, a fire, or whatever, or the absence of, fairly clearly on that imagery. It's only 10 meters in resolution, but it does a pretty good job. And that sentinel-hub.com, I believe, is the website to go to the EO browser. So definitely check that out if you're getting into it for the first time, because that tends to be where everybody gets started.
Yeah, and I imagine the cost ultimately is also affected by your protocol, as Radio Nukes just suggested, of checking free sites first, then potentially buying low res, especially if you're searching for something and you don't know this precise location in advance. You can buy cheaper and then kind of get higher resolution, more expensive once you know it's likely to have what you're looking for. So I just suspect there's quite a learning curve. I think a lot of it also, from watching some of the conversations that go back and forth between the folks who do satellite analysis regularly, is anticipating what sites are likely to be interesting. It's not just a matter of what's the breaking news, because usually that's just battle damage assessment, so much as if you're actually trying to generate new information, you need the contextual information to direct you to why that site is of interest in the first place. So it's, you climb the value chain by being more embedded in the community, is what I'm trying to say. I know that Woke has been waiting a long time, but I'm going to go to radio first, and then we'll go to Woke.
Let me make this real quick, and I'm sorry, but I need to throw this out there. Don't go buy imagery of something like the Kerch Bridge strike, because all the companies are going to release that imagery for free for everybody, and their best resolution imagery, it'll all turn up. So don't do that. And the other thing is if you do want to buy imagery of some kind of a strike or something, if it was big news, you might want to check some of the other satellite accounts, because chances are that it'll already be there. And I have done this. I've spent money on something just to go find.
Is it just me? I think we may have lost radio.
Yeah, we lost him.
Okay. But yeah, that's a great point. And I think included in what radio was saying right at the end there is, if something's popular, frankly, there are people who have access through institutional deals, academic access, and so on, where they're already prepaid, so their cost is not something they're concerned about, or they, may have more timely access. So if they get to it faster, if you're trying to do it to generate attention, you're likely to be beaten anyway. So I find the most interesting imagery pull downs are those where people are pursuing leads that they've generated themselves, as opposed to just chasing the news. But Woke, go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say, in terms of what Exit was speaking to, if anyone wanted to, everyone was speaking to people contributing, or if they wanted to learn. Another aspect of it is, if you don't want to do the actual analysis and imagery stuff, you could offer services, and that's what I'm proposing. Like, I could put videos together, but I don't actually have to do the gathering of the information necessarily. Like, you might look at imagery and you might want to take it a step further, and you might say, oh, I know so-and-so can put the images together in a video. So that's just kind of, throwing that out there. Hopefully you guys agree. Also, in terms of images on there that are not high resolution, there is a pretty easy way to turn images into high resolution images. Has that been, I can't be the first person that thought of this. Is there some sort of restriction on that? Do you know if it's been done? Has anyone tried it? Can you turn one of their images into a high-res image without some, I can't imagine what the issue with that would be. Although there could be, I don't know. And then, there was one more thing. Crap. If I think about it, I'll put my hand.
Yeah, no problem. If it comes back to you, with your first point about sort of taking contribution from people with different skills, we're definitely open to that. We don't have a defined organization. Do you know what I mean? So there are other outlets like GeoConfirmed or Project Owl or Bellingcat who have Discord servers where, if you're interested in contributing, feel free to check those out. We have bounced around the idea of having a Discord where people can contribute. That takes some overhead effort in terms of administering it, and so it's something we're definitely exploring. We just don't have anything that we can make public about it right now. But maybe what I'll say is watch this space if you're somebody who can contribute, in that when doing the geolocations and the like, everything from translation to equipment recognition to unit recognition, like patches and so on, all of those things are involved, and they don't necessarily require interaction with the imagery providers. With regard to high resolution versus low resolution, I think what you might be referring to is something I see people talk about as AI upscaling. And others may have better opinions on it, but I don't think you can add data in where it doesn't exist. And that essentially the appearance of additional definition in those images is based on AI trying to interpret additional detail but it's, if you're looking at satellite imagery, it can't actually reveal anything. So it in fact could introduce confusion where AI thinks there is something, or there may have been detail in fact in the real world and AI doesn't anticipate that it would be there, and so it gives the impression there is nothing when it appears to fill in with higher resolution. So I don't know that it works for imagery analysis. I think it's more just to make videos look a little bit more pleasing to the eye. And I do know that I've seen criticism when it's been applied to video work that might be used for evidentiary purposes, that it can, reduce or eliminate evidentiary value because it's like doctoring an image. But we'll go to Radio Nukes, who I think may be responding to this, and then to Polaris.
Yeah, real quick. So yeah, I think that is what you're talking about, AI upscaling. One thing that can be done with satellite imagery with AI or your photo tools is the HDR toning. A lot of times you'll get an image where the really bright areas are totally blown out and oversaturated, and the dark areas there's still detail there, but if you try to lighten the whole image, you lose the dark areas or light areas, or vice versa. So we'll do a HDR toning. There are some AI tools that I'm kind of looking at for that, but I haven't figured them all out. So that is something you can do. And then one more point, a lot of the times when you have these deals with the satellite providers, they give you a maximum resolution that you can release the imagery to the public. I have zero idea what happens if you take a 1024 image or 1024 by 1024, which that is a common number you'll see thrown out for different providers, and make that into a 4,000 by 4,000 pixel image with AI. Does that violate your terms? That would be something you'd want to clear up before doing that as well.
Does it have to be AI though? Because I believe you can upscale without AI prior to having high resolution. Like high resolution isn't a new concept, right? So I don't know, but I think you guys get what I was getting at. AI would be tricky right now. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the reason that they have to use AI is that, or whatever, it's not exactly AI, they're just sophisticated algorithms. But the idea is that the raw data collected at the pixel level, if you're getting the most detailed data that the imagery equipment is collecting, you can't actually get more detail than that. And so anything that claims to be adding information in is not information collected in the original. I think there may be cases where an image has been collected and then it's been compressed, or it's had other modifications done to it. And then there are things you can do to try to restore some more of the original quality to it. But again, that implies, I think, a little bit of interpretation. But I'm not an imagery expert. I'm a casual in this field.
But like he said, highlighting areas versus adding things to areas, like things that wouldn't be visible, right? You couldn't do that. But bringing things to light that were dark, like he was saying, right. Playing with the different. Okay, I'll shut up.
Yep. Contrast and all those sorts of things. Maybe what we'll have to do at some point is have in somebody who does not specifically satellite imagery analysis, but even just photo manipulation would be interesting, because I know Bellingcat has worked with some tools to determine if a photo has been manipulated, and I played with some of those before, so maybe we'll do a segment on that. That's a good discussion. I'm glad that people are getting so interested in sort of the imagery analysis. We went a little longer than I expected, which is no problem. Just before moving on, I was curious to ask about one update. In one of our previous spaces, Radio and Nukes, We discussed your post where you had speculated that some GPS jamming was from potentially a jammer set way up high in mountains. Just because of the range involved, I think you were inferring if it is a jammer, it would have to be high up in mountains. But then others came back and suggested it may be jamming from some aircraft. Did you have any additional detail on that? Do you have any other ways to investigate that?
I'm working on it.
Okay. All right.
We're looking into it. I would say that, that was just pattern matching of some curves of coverage areas. And we have two locations that fit, and I'm trying to differentiate between those two locations right now.
Okay. Great. And when your work comes out, hopefully we'll be able to chat about how you got to it. I think that's it for the introductory, resources. I do like to highlight work done by those in the community. Like, I think it's important because if we have people here who can speak to firsthand how they did their work and that inspires others to start doing the same, I think that's hugely valuable, even if it means we get a little bit less time to run through the news. I will start in with updates. And so I'll start by discussing some recent developments in connection with the offensive. I'll remind you that friends of ours like Andrew Perpetua do specific mapping work, and they're much more up to the minute, and they often have their own contacts on the ground. Usually when I talk about updates in connection with the offensive, it's more like subjects that I feel are overlooked or very broad strokes, just for those who haven't been in the news and want a quick audio update. So to start with, if you look at the first item in the nest, as usual, I've pulled together the most recent versions of the maps from some of the popular sources, which include the Institute for the Study of War, War Mapper, linked to Andrew's map. Defmon continues to maintain his map, even if he doesn't post about it on Twitter on a daily basis anymore. The Project Owl UA control map, Poulet Volant. Poulet I include partly because he does sort of like a color differential that shows just the change in control, which is, I think, in some ways easier to read at a glance, even though lately there hasn't been a lot of change in the line of control. A link to the Deep State map. GeoConfirmed maintains their own map, and then I've included, because I think it's relevant in the mapping context, the most recent weather update for along the front line, prepared by our friend David Helms. So check those out. I'll put up the first couple of details in connection with the offensive. The first of which is a discussion about a Russian push up near Svatov. And several mappers had suggested that the Russians had advanced in that area. And so you'll be able to see the graphic when it populates in the nest in just a moment. So you'll see the first item is a tweet from Rob Lee. Rob is just passing along a graphic taken from the Deep State map. And the suggestion is that Russia is pushing on this eastern part of the front in order to distract Ukraine from its ongoing efforts along the southern Zaporizhia front. And if we had recent reports from Hanna Maliar and other spokespersons for Ukraine that despite the Russian push along that eastern front, that they weren't making very much progress, but now it seems that they have advanced somewhat. So you can see the graphic there, and keep an eye on that region in the work done by some of the other mappers I've highlighted. The second item back in the nest is yesterday's update from Nalcio in the losses verified by photographs. So this is Nalcio is a significant contributor to Oryx's project. So his numbers are drawn from Oryx's database, and he does it just since the beginning of the offensive. What caught my attention there were two things. The first of which is total equipment losses. About a week ago when we spoke to them, had reached the ratio of 1 to 1. Given that the attacker is usually at a disadvantage, you would expect them to take greater losses. By this week, at least according to their collection standards, it's past 1 to 1, so that Russia now has more total vehicle losses than does Ukraine during the offensive, which is good news for Ukraine. The other feature I am paying attention to is the types of vehicles that are lost. I spoke to this before. You'll see that Ukraine has lost many more infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, but that Russia has lost considerably more artillery. And lots of people have spoken to that being a specific Ukrainian strategy to attrit Russian artillery. And it seems like they're pretty successful in that. So you can compare the numbers in those columns. The third item back in the nest is a tweet from Meduza, which is a Russian news outlet. And this is coverage of an additional strike. I don't think this is the Oktrobyskoye airfield that they're referring to. I think it may be another site that's along the main rail line that connects the Kerch Bridge up into the Mariupol region. That was struck in a drone attack. And the critical point here is that because of this strike, the rail traffic along that line has been temporarily paused. I haven't seen any more information on how long temporarily is, but in combination with the most recent attack on the Kerch Bridge, any of these strikes on that rail line are critically important because it seems like it's the primary lifeline for supply of Russia into Crimea. And it was first spotted, I believe, reference to the rail shutdown was first spotted because there was an announcement that rail traffic across the bridge would be suspended. And people had thought, oh, perhaps the rail span sustained some damage in that attack. So that idea was floating around from a few people. But in fact, it appears to be that the further down the line has been closed because of this nearby strike, and that it's backing up and causing a closure of traffic across the bridge. The fourth item back in the nest, I include as a bit of a follow-up. This is a recent video of the state of the Kakova reservoir. In that, about 2 weeks ago, there was a bit of a flurry of activity, people speculating on the potential for Ukraine to cross the reservoir. I'm not putting this because in this video, you can see that there are still significant portions of the reservoir that have large sections of water. I'm not saying that these are impassable, but some of the video that was coming out 2 weeks ago seemed to show that the bed of the reservoir was drying out very quickly. There was, sort of the cracking of the surface as it dried out. But both this video that's in the nest and related videos in the last few days show that there are large sections that remain very marshy. And if they were to be crossed, may require, either specialized vehicles or there were some ground cover systems, sort of roadways to cover soft ground that were highlighted by accounts. At the time, the speculation was at a fever pitch, but it doesn't seem like it's going to just completely dry out along its whole length. So there will probably still be either river crossings or sort of wetland crossings. Exit, go ahead.
I was just going to say, from a perspective of if you were trying to understand what normal is or trying to understand what the new normal is for that particular river, and you're new to OSINT and just want something kind of easy to start tracking satellite images of where it starts to dry out, who's using different parts of that river might be a really, especially in places where it maybe doesn't have contact on it, but up around the dam and stuff where there might be more civilian use, might be a really interesting thing to start tracking because it will change. And of course, at some point more rain will come and all of those other things, and watching kind of how that changes over the next year or however long it is before they actually can build back dams and bridges and all of those other things. That would be a really interesting story to follow if somebody had the time to do it.
Part of the curse is, for those who are really interested in these subjects, you always have more interesting ideas and you have time to pursue them. So I see what Exit is doing. She's slowly farming out her ideas, hoping that others will do that work. The fifth item back in the nest is just an update. Brady Afric has stayed very dedicated to this issue of following Russian fortifications in occupied territories, and I raise it just because I think it's important to keep in mind that Russia is not entirely sitting idle. They have, through the weeks since the offensive launched, continued to construct additional fortifications. And Brady, in this thread, it links both to his map that has an overall picture of everything he's found so far, but then also he's done some GIFs or graphics just to show individual fortifications as they're expanded through satellite imagery. Last item in this block, you'll see it's the sixth item back. It's the tweet by Michael Weiss. He has a contact that he refers to as Carl, and I'll highlight that this is opinion, but Michael Weiss has been posting Carl's thoughts on the war, for more than a year now, and usually his source Carl has some interesting opinions. Often it's just saying plainly what perhaps is not readily said from official sources, and his contact Carl seems to be quite even-headed. Occasionally I disagree with him, as is only natural, but I put that up just if you want a quick summary with the thoughts of somebody who is, on the ground on how things are developing. Check out that thread. All right, I put a new block of material in the nest. If you have a look at the first item on the left, you'll see, I'll admit, I hadn't come across this map before. I don't know if it's brand new or not, but this is a map that is being put together by the war spotting team. One comment on Oryx's work is that because of the volume, they try to be comprehensive, which is terrific. Because of the volume, particularly originally when it was a small team and there was fighting happening through the whole country, they were not trying to geolocate the individual images of losses. Interestingly, war spotting, and I'd have to contact their team to get a better sense of what time frame of losses they're including here, to know if there's selection bias or any of those factors influencing what shows up in the map. But they are now geolocating many of their images of lost vehicles, and they're putting them on a map. And so I have little doubt that some of the enterprising folks who have been pushing to work together, whether it be, Brady Afric's map of fortifications being integrated with GeoConfirmed, which is integrating some information, I think, from the Center for Information Resilience. I think they're all trying to work together. Hopefully, war spottings, losses, geolocations will be included in one of those overarching comprehensive maps. I just haven't heard officially yet because I only saw this tweet a few hours ago. So I'm not sure, but you might want to check out how expansive it's going to get. The second item back in the nest is a tweet from Andrew Perpetua. He's passing along some information pulled from Telegram, noting that sappers in the Kherson region surveyed 64,000 hectares, and they determined that there were 86,000, almost 87,000 explosive objects detected in that area, which works out to 1.35 items of unexploded ordnance per hectare. And keep in mind that there was obviously some fairly intense fighting in Kherson. It's not clear that it was mined as intensively as other regions, Zaporizhia the Donbass have been. So this would vary by region, but it's the first time I've seen numbers published on, rate of explosives per square area. Exit, go ahead.
So just to put some context around that, because hectares they use a lot in Europe. Over in North America, if you're like me, you use acres most of the time. There's 2.47 acres in a hectare, which I just looked up to double check. I was actually somewhat surprised that this number was as low as it was. I am quite confident that it is much higher up near the Kharkiv area, for sure. But I would kind of remind you all that it really doesn't matter like how big or small that number is. If you don't know where those mines are and you're driving a tractor over it, let's say a normal field at my farm would be 150 acres. In that one field, you're going to hit a fair number of mines and you have no idea where those are. That's a big deal, and it's going to take out a lot of people along the way. And I will keep shouting that mines are a massive issue in Ukraine, and it's going to be years and years and years before it's even somewhat reasonable to move forward in a lot of those areas.
Those are good points. I would be interested. I'll have to dig through Andrew's link to the Telegram to see if they added additional context. It may be that they tried to survey the entirety of Kherson, and that there would be large portions where there wasn't fighting, included, that never came under Russian control. But I'm not. Oh, well, Andrew's joined us, so maybe he can explain. Go ahead, Andrew.
There's some context that I just know from past reading that they didn't really mention. So you keep in mind that they are demining the most important areas first, and to them, the most important area is typically a highway, and also roads to utilities and bridges and things like that. So they're not necessarily demining giant fields, which is where probably most of the mines are. They're just demining like the road and the streets of a town, and like the area that people might walk. Those are the areas that they're demining right now. So all those other areas where most of the actual fighting was going on really isn't touched yet.
Thanks for that context. It's when they refer to that big an area being examined, when you use a term like survey, it makes people think perhaps they're doing a survey of what they believe is a representative sample, like say there's this much green space, there's this much urban space, and that they try and survey an appropriate amount of regions like that would be representative of the whole area, but it's not clear that they actually did that. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just on the mines. So I'm not a civilian deminer, but my unit did work with those in Kosovo. I mean, the first phase is an assessment phase of exactly where is all the stuff and what is safe, what is unsafe. So it makes sense that that's already started. To Exit's point, I would say one maybe silver lining on this very sad mine situation is that demining fields, farm fields, is actually the easiest environment in this kind of country to demine. It lends itself very nicely to mine flails and other kinds of heavy equipment like that can do this. I can't speak to contamination or anything like that. I don't know how all that works, but that's just one slightly positive thing is that demining farm fields is actually much more simple than trying to demine forested areas or overgrown brush, things like that. You may see that the fields are clear, but the tree lines are not, for example.
Well, thanks for that additional context. It will be interesting to see if they release any updated numbers on the same region so that we can compare and say a first pass found this rate, but upon examination of either a different sample or closer examination, that the number's gone up or down. At least it's a baseline to start from. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, there have been pretty regular reports coming out about this. It's just like kind of nobody talks about it. I can't remember his name. The mayor of Crivi Ree, he posts like a Sunday update where he almost always talks about this, and he references like all the government resources that are doing this, like the police or whoever's doing it. So but his Sunday updates are pretty good if you want to read them. A lot of them are like very local news that you probably don't care about, like the graduating class of Crivi Ree or something like that. But yeah, you can read that if you want to. It's just kind of buried in the news.
Yeah, if you want granular data, you have to get way down into the weeds. A quick search, is that mayor's name Alexander Vilkel?
Yeah, that's him.
Yeah, okay. So for anybody who wants to try to find him, it's Alexander with an O, Vilkul, Vilkul, at least in Roman alphabet. Okay. Well, if it's being reported on, what we really need is to find somebody who is interested in the issue of mines, and who can dive into it and kind of consolidate all the mine issues in like an update once or twice a week. That would be a great project. Go ahead, Wolverine.
So I'm kind of like, I just got in late on this. I'm kind of curious, is like with the mining and all that stuff, what exactly are you looking for?
Oh, well, we were just reporting on some data on number of unexploded ordnance, whether that's mines or just unexploded bombs, missiles, per hectare or per acre, because there was an initial report coming out of Kherson on that. And I just like to highlight new data points. So that's what the conversation was about.
Okay, so when you mean surveying, you're actually meaning surveying of mainline communications or MSRs, ASRs, or are you talking like in the areas that the civilians are going to have to worry about operating in when they're doing farming?
Yeah, so if you have a look at the third test, that's what it's conversation. It's Andrew Perpetuous tweet. And we were having a bit of a discussion about whether we were aware about whether it was clearing the highest priority routes only, or whether it was a representative survey to try to get a sense of all regions. And Andrew seems to believe it's focused on high priorities, highways and routes to utilities. So that's the context we have for the number. And I'm raising
that
it.
Would actually, yeah. That would be correct. It is going to be, but you have to look at the areas that they're going to be using, and because the biggest thing that they're going to have to worry about is getting, their armor units. They got protection from it, but it's the logistics guys too, because a lot of them are just driving around in unarmored trucks, and that's the biggest thing you got to look for. So yeah, they're going to sit there and clear out MSRs, ASRs. They're going to, bridges, but they also have to do the engineer recon element before they do an attack somewhere, especially if because what they'll do is they'll send out, it's like a 4 or 5 man team, and their job is actually to find out what the density is, and what the mixture of is, and what actual type of mine, so that they know what to deal with and how to actually take care of it when they have to breach it or whatever they're going to have to do to it, because there are mines out there that will actually take 2 hits from a Miklik. I don't know about the UR-77, but there are some mines that will take double hits from it, and it takes them that many to actually detonate. So that's one thing that they have to worry about as well, is if there's those types. But if they're just using what is it, TM62s, I think, is that the main one, or this TM52s is the main one it seems like they're using. And as long as they know how to use them, then that's fine. But The priority is going to go to that kind of stuff. Anything that does with getting the combat units through, the logistics through, and the actual combat zone of where they're going to do their attacks at.
You make a great point about the mix of mines in there. And so this was from the Kherson region, most of which is now liberated. And so while there was fighting there, it's not clear that the intentional laying of minefields was as dense there as in other places. I know that some of the civilian demining units will occasionally publish a bit of detail on the nature of what they find, whether I think they break it down on the basis of whether they're like literally mines or whether they're just unexploded ordnance. And that additional level of detail would be great to get into. I'm just not sure that it's consistently available. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. Is this switch from the military reduction of explosive hazards to the civilian demining activities, and that's much more traceable. The civilian side. Ukraine has a central database for this. They have a central office for explosive hazards. Obviously, they've had it set up and been tracking it since the withdrawal from Kyiv, and then, of course, withdrawal from Kharkiv, and now, of course, in Kherson. It should be possible, but unfortunately, I haven't seen the clear data. It's great that Andrew points out this resource from the government, but links to the data from Kyiv on their central database I haven't seen. We may get signals from the various, like you said, Michael, the various civilian demining initiatives that are there. But it would be interesting to know as they go through their assessment phase. We've already seen some reports of it, but yeah. Anyway, I'll stop. Sorry.
Well, no, thanks for that. I'm glad lots of people are looking at it. And go ahead, Exit.
It occurs to me, given some of the conversations that I've had trying to track this, that it might not be something that they are actively trying to publicize on a regular basis. I have been trying to reach out and get a lot of that data from some of the sources that they have, and I have been told a couple times that so far they aren't willing to spend the time to publicize that, and they have not been clear on whether or not that is an OPSEC issue or an actual time issue. So I would just say there's definitely lots of people out there looking for it, and it doesn't seem like it's something that they want to have public just quite yet.
Well, I'm glad people are digging at the issue. Continuing in the updates, the next item was also related to mines, but it's an overview of the issue. So if you have a look at the third item back in the nest, it's the tweet by Dan Lamoth, who writes for the Washington Post. And it's sort of an overview of the problem, noting that Ukraine is now the world's most mined country, and that it will probably take decades ultimately to make it safe. So if you want a broad handle on the problem, have a look at that article. The fourth and fifth items back in the nest, I actually spoke to fairly briefly already, and this refers to the closure of that railway that runs from the Kerch Bridge up toward Mariupol, and the fact that it's temporarily closed. And so I forgot that I had put those links down in the agenda. So there you have it. If you want your sourcing on the announcements of the closure and the speculation from Oliver Alexander about whether the closure related to damage on the bridge or whether it was connected with the drone strike. Interestingly, I'll point out that tweet from Oliver Alexander, which I just put some new material up, so it now may be pushed back to the 8th or 9th item in the nest. But Oliver Alexander in that tweet says that he does believe that there was some damage that was caused in the most recent attack to the train bridge, which is not something I've heard elsewhere. Let me just see if I can pull up what he says on my screen quickly. So in Oliver Alexander's tweet, he's just referring to TASS announcing that traffic would be closed. In the replies, somebody asked him, did those drones damage the rail bridge? I saw that they drove a train right over afterward, and it looks like the rail section wasn't affected. And Oliver replies, the rail bridge was damaged about 200 meters away from the damaged section of the road bridge, although the damage does not look that extensive. Did anybody else see that damage to the rail bridge? I didn't.
In some of the satellite pictures, I recall seeing what appeared to be possible discoloration from fire damage, but my recollection was that was kind of closer to where the damage to the road bridge was. So I don't know about like 200 meters off from where the impact on the road bridge was.
Interesting. I only found that note from Oliver just an hour or two before we started, so I haven't had time to dig into it, but maybe somebody will be inspired to go and look. I'll go to Gurney and then Wolverine. Go ahead, Gurney.
Yes, so there's video from the road deck, and I don't know if it's near the roadway that's damaged. I can't tell if you can see that in the foreground, but there was a video clip shared about a week ago that was looking from the road deck out to the rail bridge, and you could see minor damage. And the reason the video looked like it was being filmed was because there was a train that was stopped on the actual rail bridge, and there were workers on the rail bridge. Not sure, you can't really ascertain what they were doing, but there might have been about 20 to 30 workers that were at the stopped train on the rail bridge, and you could see very light damage below the railroad tracks, but you couldn't. I couldn't make out more. And again, I couldn't ascertain whether the video was near the damaged roadway. I couldn't tell anything else like time or date to source that video, but I know that came out sort of similar about a week ago. So it's out there, floating around.
It's interesting because at the time of the strike, initial reports were that there were 2 blasts, and there was speculation that perhaps the rail bridge may have been targeted as well. I just hadn't seen anything conclusive saying, yes, it was targeted, but it doesn't appear to have been significantly damaged. So if anybody sees more on that, let us know. Go ahead, Wolverine.
I was just going to say that I had been looking over a couple different Telegram channels, or mainly Ukrainian ones, and there had been mentioning 2 different ones. I think one was United 24 Media or something like that, but I did see where that they were mentioning about that the rail portion had actually been damaged, but it didn't go a lot into too much information or about it though.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Again, if you find anything, let us know. This next little update, it's a small section. This is a bit more philosophical. It's not so much about the overall progress of the offensive as you see the issue of journalists being killed in the war in different contexts. Often it's, a tragedy early on in the war, for example, where lines were mixed because the Russian occupied areas were more widespread across the country, and you were getting journalists be traveling across the country, and then their cars would be shot, or they would be filming in a civilian area well away from the fighting, and then there would be shelling and journalists would be injured and killed. In this case, the first item in the nest is a Russian, we'll call him correspondent, who was just killed in a Ukrainian artillery strikes, reportedly using the new U.S. supply cluster munitions. But I wanted to highlight that when this goes around, his situation is much more gray. It is not nearly as clear-cut as the Western journalists I know of who have been killed. And now, of course, this is not the first Russian journalist or correspondent who has been killed. But in his case, if you have a look back at, so the first item is just war translated covering it, including a translation of the report of his being killed. But the second and third items back in the nest, the second highlights that he wasn't a journalist, that for a long time he had actually been an armed combatant, and it was only recently he had decided to be a correspondent, and that he appeared to switch back and forth between roles from time to time. The third item back is a highlight of his name was Zaravlov, and that he was involved in the initial invasion in 2014, and was pictured at that time capturing Ukrainian territory. So it's this murky situation where it's not quite as clear. Now, I appreciate that it's possible for a fighter or a combatant to change profession and switch to reporting. In general, you would want to minimize civilian casualties, including those to reporters. But the fourth item back in the nest makes the point that in this case, so this is Oliver Alexander's tweet, if you're a journalist, if you are so close to a military unit, in this case, he was reporting on the operations of an MLRS unit. If you're so close that you are killed by counter battery fire aimed at the MLRS, then that is a casualty that would be very difficult to avoid. So if you see claims that Ukraine has killed some journalists, I'm just highlighting this as an example of, do dig into the details to understand, are they embedded with a unit? Were they perhaps not embedded, but right on the front line? Were they previously a fighter? Is it clear that their status is that of a reporter and the like? Go ahead, Wolverine.
So this I have a lot of experience in because I was a contractor and we deal with a lot of the same things. And I myself was actually attached to a Marine unit. I was initially attached to the MEF, but because of what my job was, they actually put me down to a battalion level unit, and then I ended up at a company level unit. So for us, there was back then, there was no, there wasn't a whole lot about, what the civilians do and stuff like that. We are kind of left on our own sometimes. But when you look at like our how we do it, with the laws of war and everything, if a civilian is a civilian, if he's just walking around and with us, and the thing is when they just say civilian, it doesn't matter what the profession is. It doesn't matter the reporter. It does matter if they're like medical personnel, but otherwise that medical personnel are the only ones that have the separate exemptions where a reporter wouldn't. So, like if we're in combat and they see a medic and he's got, a clear identification on himself, he's not supposed to be engaged. But unless the medic sits there and poses fire on him and is trying to defend you, then that's the gray area. But reporters they're not covered under that portion at all. So that when they go out there at their own risk. And, they got the body armor and the helmets, all that stuff. The problem is like example, like when I was in Iraq, okay, the Iraqis didn't care who you are. They didn't care who you work with. They're like, if you were an American, it didn't matter. You could sit there and have the biggest red crescent, the biggest red cross on your vehicle. They would use that as a target. They would still shoot at you, okay, indiscriminately. Civilian, military, not, they didn't care. So, for me, it was easier. I would ride around and I would have, like my old Marine uniform on, my body armor, I was wearing the same body armor as the Marines. I was wearing the same helmet as the Marines because in that case, it was safer for me to actually blend in with the Marines than stand out, because if you stand out, then you're a target. They did have like some KDR personnel who actually got snatched out of their trucks, and some got away, some didn't. So my choice was, they're going to shoot at me anyways. I'm just going to blend in, and did some stuff happen where I got into firefights? Yes, I did, but it was I'm not sitting here engaging someone. I'm defending myself, and that's another gray area. But when you go back and forth from a civilian, or let's say a civilian position, to a combatant, okay, the first time they see you they don't care. If you're firing at them, that's all they see. They're going to get that whoever is shooting at them, they're going to get shot. They don't care who it is anymore. And the laws of war cover that. But like I said, when it's a civilian reporter goes out there, he is on his own, okay? The unit lots of times the units, they're like, oh, okay, we got a civilian. Okay, yeah, dude, if something happens, you're like fucked and you're on your own, and you're gonna have to do this by yourself. That's literally how it happens sometimes. You know, if you get good in with the unit, sometimes they might take care of you, sometimes they might not. It just depends. And like you said, artillery, right? Like the guy was, you know, when you were just mentioning the counter battery, right? Well, I was in Fallujah, and during it was either, I can't remember, it was the first offensive or the second offensive, but I think it was the first one. Sorry, it was the first one. We had an artillery battery with us, and they were firing missions into the city of Fallujah. The insurgents were firing 122 Katyushas back at us, and they're not like firing them off of like a Grad launcher or something like that. They're just like setting them on whatever and firing them. So the thing is yeah, they're doing their own version of counter battery, but it's very indiscriminate. And we had like their counter battery coming in, and some of the rounds were faulty, and they were like detonating right above me. So even if, like that guy said, if you're getting counter battery, you're too close. It's not always true. You can be in a big ass fob like I was, and still get counter battery just doing your job out there. So a situation like that, it's yes, you're up front. You get a good rapport with the unit. You have to make sure that you're wearing proper gear. You know, it may save you. Sometimes it may not. But artillery is very indiscriminate. You know, it doesn't care if you're the good guys or bad guys. If it hits, it hits. Who's ever there is going to get hit. So it's a huge situation and a lot of gray areas when civilians are actually out in the combat zone, especially reporters.
Well, and I highlight this story particularly because there were two recent examples that represent other points on the spectrum of combatant through to reporter. There was just on Thursday's space, we reported on the death of somebody. He was definitely a member of the Russian military, but he also simultaneously ran a Telegram account with 20-some thousand subscribers. So he, had a little bit of online attention. Then you have this person who was just killed in those sources, who formerly was a soldier, appears to have transitioned to being a correspondent, but was kind of open to sort of playing at being more like a soldier at times. Then you have high-profile people who are well known as reporters, like Solovyev, who you see going up toward the front lines, not wearing press indicators, wearing body armor and camouflage and markings that seem to suggest he may be a combatant or would increase the odds he's mistaken for combatant. So I'm just pointing out that this is one in a point on a spectrum of blurring of lines. The next quick update, I try and lay these out in a logical order. So this is sort of a transition between sections on developments in the offensive and equipment. We'll get into equipment next. But this is about delays in training. And there were a few articles on that front I thought I would just bring together. The first item in the nest is from Tyler Rogaway, who writes for The War Zone. And he's just highlighting that the long delays in getting training for Ukrainian pilots up and running will probably be seen as one of the most massive and foreseeable missteps. And so in his thread, he's included several articles that they have from the War Zone over the last year about, calling for this training to begin. So it's not, he's sort of making the case that this was definitely foreseeable. And we were specifically saying that if we miss this opportunity, we're going to wind up in a spot where we regret it. And I think now he's essentially saying, I told you so. The second item back in the nest, is what caught my attention on the delays in training issue. It's a tweet from Jack Watling, who's with RUSI, which is the Royal United Services Institute. And his article is about the costs of delaying the training of Ukrainian forces. And so there are some details in there about the nature of the training programs and reasons why they may be delayed, but ultimately highlighting that the costs of delay are significant and may be underestimated. So Jack writes well, so you probably want to check that one out. Finally, in this kind of block, this is an opinion, but it's the third item back in the nest. It's from David Secret Squirrel, who makes the argument. So number one, it was announced, or I'll be honest, I'm not sure if it was announced. I know that it was written about that the company Draken, which is the company that was going to be purchasing the F-16s from, I believe, the Netherlands. Ultimately, they managed to, end that contract, reverse that contract, so that the F-16s could potentially be available for Ukraine. But Draken, the company that was going to buy them, is going to undertake the training of Ukrainian pilots. And David, in this third tweet back in the nest, is making the point, given they're a private training outfit, that may be good, and that it sounds like the F-16s will not be sent with all of the same air-to-air systems, and that there may not be as much opportunity given integration into a network of sensors to engage in air-to-air, so they're more likely to be used as essentially bomb trucks or just bomb delivery, suggesting that the amount of training that's necessary for those missions may be less, and therefore pilots may get through the training for it faster. I don't know if anybody has an opinion on whether that's likely, whether they'll shorten the training cycle, but I thought it was an interesting hypothesis. Go ahead, Colby.
So the reporting that I've seen is that they are going to be part of the training mission that's going to happen in Romania, and the training that's supposed to happen in Romania is not scheduled to begin until next year. So that's more of a long-term program, and I'm not sure yet what exactly the short-term training solution is going to be. It seems that that's still getting worked out between the United States and Denmark and the Netherlands and other countries that are involved with this. And obviously, NSA Sullivan saying that this is all going to be done by the end of the year, so that remains to be seen. I'm a little bit skeptical, but we'll see. But as far as Draken's participation in this, the training program, it seems to me that that's a long-term endeavor that's going to happen in Romania, because the training infrastructure there doesn't exist, is how I understand it. They still have to set that up, and that's going to be a sort of a long-term sustainment plan to ensure that future ground crews, future pilots are adequately trained going into the future.
The specific updates I had heard on timing, initially there was talk about training beginning in that joint program by the end of June, which obviously didn't happen. I think most recently Zelensky came out and said that following meetings at the Vilnius summit, he had been informed about the time frame, but when he said, "I know what the time frame is," he didn't disclose it publicly. So I haven't heard what it will be, but Zelensky seemed to suggest that it was set. So hopefully we'll proceed. For those who haven't been right up on it, the UK has said they will begin the more fundamental training, which is sort of basic flight competency, as I understand it. I believe that training may actually have already begun by this point, but it's not specific training to the F-16. Okay, jumping into some updates on equipment from the last few days. The first tweet in the nest, you'll see that a member of the Verona Rada, the Ukrainian legislature, Yehor Chernyev, came out and said that Ukraine has developed its own medium-range air defense systems that are similar to the Hawk, and that system is now being tested and further developed. The second, which is good news, obviously, because we'll get into the strikes on Odessa, and there are lots of ongoing strikes where additional air coverage just outside of the major cities would still be of use, and so the ability to develop a domestic program will hopefully help with that. The second item in the nest is John Ridge's tweet in response to that, and John knows lots about missile systems, so I often think his opinion is likely to be correct. He's suggesting that based on the discussed range he would speculated that Ukraine may have taken the R-27 surface-to-air missile and the Coral system and combined them. So you can see John's thinking there. If anybody has any more specifics on that, feel free to come up and let us know. But I think at this point, we're just, that's John's informed speculation. The third item back in the nest on Ukrainian equipment is the update that Germany has overcome some hurdles in order to manufacture new ammo for the Gepard, which is 35 millimeter. And apparently they will be committing to provide 300,000 more rounds, including 40,000 that are expected to be delivered this year. And if you want to see more of the original details, if you scroll down in that tweet, I believe it's the fourth back in the nest from, it's DEAIDUA.org, who they do very good work covering German weapons provision to Ukraine. But if you scroll down in that tweet, his last one in the thread is a link to Bild, the German newspaper that broke the story. Excuse me, that was the third item back in the nest. The fourth back in the nest from that same account that tracks German systems provisions was the fact that Germany has now announced that they will be providing 10 laser designators. And apparently these laser designators are for use with the Volcano 155 millimeter precision ammo, which is interesting. I don't recall, maybe somebody can fill me in. Does the Excalibur work on a laser designator system, or is it a different system for
no, it's GPS.
GPS, yeah. So that's interesting to me.
Copperhead. Oh, sorry. What Copperhead does, and they do have Copperhead rounds over there, so they do need laser designators for Copperhead.
Okay, interesting. So some are GPS. So what, the Excalibur are GPS targeted, and the Copperhead are laser targeted? Is that what I'm hearing? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So it wouldn't be the first laser guided precision artillery rounds, but now some of the German systems will be provided. So watch for more precise strikes. So that was it for that block, but we'll go to Wolverine.
No, I was just saying is that those laser designators, you can actually use them for a multitude of different weapon systems. It's just having the code that you need to be able, so the aircraft can see it and stuff like that too. So as long as they have the same codes, it doesn't matter if it's a laser airdrop laser guided munition, or if it's a laser guided munition fired out of like an artillery piece. You can actually use either or as long as you have the code, because there was actually a video posted not long ago where they were saying, I don't know how the true this is, but that they used the laser guided designator off of a Stugna P to guide in I believe it was a Copperhead round. So that when I saw that, that was interesting. That means that they must have been able to get the coding or whatever between those two systems to work.
That's interesting. I don't know. John is here. Maybe John knows whether the Stugna's laser designator meets NATO's STANAG for laser designators. I forget what number it is off the top of my head, but I assume that these IRIS-T ones meet that standard and can work with all the other NATO standard laser designators that they already have.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, just regarding the Stugna P video and the Copperhead, I'm not convinced that they use Stugna P to guide the Copperhead for two reasons. I have a little bit of uncertainty about how Stugna P's what Stugna P's guidance mechanism actually is. It's claimed that it's line of sight beam riding. However, based upon actually looking at it, I don't think it is. I think it's SAP loss for the laser data link. Neither of those would be workable for designating a target because with line of sight beam riding, that's just a continuous laser pulse, more or less, and there's a receiver in the back of the missile that picks up the incoming energy and then essentially steers the missile to center itself within that beam. So as you move the beam, the missile moves to stay approximately in the center of it. With SAC loss, if it is actually doing that, which I suspect is what it's doing, given that it has an infrared flare at the back, and you don't usually have that with line of sight beam riding missiles, just SAC loss, it's probably, rather than using a wire or radio frequency to transmit the guidance data from the control station to the missile to, actuate the control surfaces appropriately, I think it's just being transmitted by a pulse laser. I don't think that's necessarily compatible with the type of laser pulse that you would need for, say, a semi-active laser homing munition like Copperhead. I could be wrong, but I would, at first guess, I would not expect them to be compatible.
Well, I like conversations like this because often it will put what's the phrase? Put a bug in your ear, or anyway, just to inspire people to go out and find the answer so that they can be precise when we get together to chat about it next time. Go ahead, Radio.
I just wanted to add a little background for the non-techno nerds here. These laser systems that they're talking about, they don't just continuously shine a laser like a laser pointer. They actually flash on and off, and they encode a designation code into that flashing so that you can discriminate different targets and things. That's what everybody's talking about. I just wanted to add that in there.
Thanks for that. Okay. I'm trying to recall whether I was done that block or not. Let me see. Where was I? So let's see. Ukraine is developing their Hawk system. Their equivalent to the Hawk system. Rheinmetall is getting Gepard ammo. Laser designators. Yeah, so that was it for that block. So if you have a look at the first item on the left of the nest, two quick tips or points on drones. The first is Ukraine continues to innovate and sort of standardize on its drone delivered munitions. And so here you have, in the image, you have two examples of new airdrop munitions, and apparently these include an inertial fuse in them for safety's sake. And there are two variants, one being a frag variant and the other apparently having I believe EFP is an explosively formed penetrator. And it connects to videos of with additional information on them on Telegram. So for those who are following the development of drone munitions, it seems like they're getting more sophisticated. And even though it looks like, for example, the tail sections are 3D printed, it looks like they're more assembly line style as opposed to being handmade at this point, which I think is an interesting development. The second item back in the nest related to that is an article in Forbes where some of our friends contributed. So Sam highlighted it, but David Hambling, who we occasionally chat with, gave advice on some new heavy bomber drones that Ukraine has gotten. Sam, in speaking with us, has expressed his interest in fixed wing bombers that obviously have a different mechanism for targeting and so on than do quadcopter or rotor wing drones. And it sounds like Ukraine is beefing up its fleet of that kind of drone bomber. And so I thought it was interesting, these first two items, the new munitions going along with the new bombing technique via drone, they sort of go together in my mind. The third item back, a few days ago, word came out that the Biden administration was very close to approving ATACMS, or that they were, considering them extremely closely. This item, third back, is a new article from the Washington Post where new sources say that the Pentagon believes that Kiev has more urgent needs than ATACMS, and they don't think that it will make a battlefield difference while it may undercut U.S. readiness. And so it's odd just to try to read the tea leaves in terms of there's enthusiasm for their possible provision, and now it seems like a backing away from that. And some analysts I've seen are interpreting this as there may be different factions, whether there's a Pentagon faction and a White House or a national security and so on, but that there may be differences of opinion as opposed to the prevailing opinion changing with time. But Colby, go ahead.
Okay. First thing, pretty much all of the numbers surrounding ATACMS production procurement in this article are all wrong. So just discount absolutely all of that. I'm working on a significant thread that will address all of these questions quite comprehensively. And I've been spending many hours of research on this, including emailing Redstone Arsenal at 1:30 in the morning last night because I'm a crazy person. But aside from that, I'll just say that the Pentagon's full of shit. The United States does not have any particular need for these ATACMS. Every theory that anybody can provide as to what they need them for is very easily verifiably false based on things that we know to be true. So this is, there are definitely lots of different factions on this. Most of them seem to be against providing ATACMS. So we can only hope that the few sane heads in the Pentagon or in the National Security Council will eventually prevail. But unfortunately, the prognosis is not particularly good right now.
I feel like we should say amen after that. John, go ahead.
I guess in terms of what is on the subject of ATACMS and what is, I guess, maybe a productive thing, maybe at the individual level, in terms of, speaking to, to one's representatives, senators, etc. What would be useful, given the potentially limited ability of Congress to directly kind of compel any action by the White House on this front, beyond kind of trying to, put pressure, is what would be helpful, at least in my view, is if there were maybe a congressional hearing or two into what ATACMS are actually allocated for in U.S. war planning. What I believe it's called is the RMF, or excuse me, it's something like the requirements process for munitions or some similar acronym to that, which is the process by which the DoD goes about calculating how much munitions and of what type it needs for various contingency scenarios. It would be good if Congress held some hearings to actually disclose what the findings of that DoD process is for ATACMS.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I lost connection for just a moment, but I wanted to say, Colby, I'll look forward to your thread correcting those numbers. Interestingly, the third item up in the nest, or excuse me, it's now the fourth, was John's same point that the numbers were not correct, just to highlight that. But go ahead, Colby.
So on one hand, I like John's suggestion of the hearings. On the other hand, if Congress were to say we're going to hold these hearings and request the Pentagon to provide that information in such a hearing, I have a very strong feeling that the Pentagon would likely say, oh, well, we can do this, but this is all far too classified, so we can't do a public hearing. It has to be a private classified briefing, which I don't think it wouldn't be useless, but I don't think it would move the needle so much, because we already have a situation in which Congress is significantly, more strongly in favor of providing ATACMS than the Biden administration is already. So perhaps such a briefing would help advocates in Congress to convince some of those who are more skeptical, perhaps. So that, I guess, that could be useful. But I don't think that the Pentagon and the Biden administration would want a public hearing in which it would become very obvious that their position is meritless. So I suspect that such a hearing would not be happening with C-SPAN cameras rolling. So I think just more lobbying is good. The more members of Congress come out in favor of ATACMS is good, to the extent that they can insert language into appropriations bills is good, although that I don't believe that would compel the Biden administration to send them. But the more pressure there is on Congress and on President Biden directly, I hope that ultimately that will succeed in tipping the scales in favor of them being provided, because Ukraine definitely does need them. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And so in a few moments, hopefully we'll get through to discussing the recent strikes against Odessa, in which, a number of the missile types that were used are types that Ukrainian air defense systems that are available cannot readily shoot down. And so several, I think, including Colby, have put out threads that make the point that perhaps responding by striking the launch sources is really the best. So offense would be the best defense in this case, and that longer range systems like Taurus or ATACMS might enable that. Okay, last block on equipment updates. I guess I'll try and move through these fairly quickly. I'm just looking at what comes up next. Yeah, so after this, a quick update on some Wagner items and Russian politics, and then we'll probably get down into the Odessa matters. So first of all, in that same Washington Post article on ATACMS, they also note that Ukraine will receive the ground-launched small diameter bombs either in the fall or the winter. Given the numerical inaccuracies in the ATACMS manufacturing that John and Colby pointed out, hopefully this fact in the article about the GL SDBs is actually correct. But a lot of people in response to this were saying, it's a shame it took this long. The second item back in the nest is a little bit of background information on this new piece of equipment that is a brimstone launching truck, a truck-mounted brimstone launcher. I recall when the brimstones were initially provided to Ukraine 8 or 9 months ago, I think, on that time frame, there was much debate about how they would be launched, as I believe they're normally air-launched. Since then, I think maybe 3 or 4 months ago, a video came out of a truck that was towing what looked like, a shop-made or sort of improvised rack that had brimstone launchers on it. So this second tweet highlights the manufacturer. Apparently, they only showed off their prototype of this brimstone launcher a year ago, and now it's reached the point where they intend to provide some to Ukraine. So hopefully that will, allow them to make use of brimstone more easily. The third item back in the nest, the third and fourth items, I think, yes, third and fourth, relate to this new explosive armor that has been spotted on Bradleys in Ukraine. It goes by the acronym BRAT, and the few analysts I've seen talking about it highlight that it's apparently very effective. Apparently, it's also quite rare, and so some seeing it were surprised it would have been included on the vehicles going to Ukraine. But to the extent it provides greater protection, that's great. It also created lots of opportunity for that meme of the line drawings of the two guys who had contact ERA to everything. Well, now they have another armor type, explosive armor type to work with. Go ahead, John.
Oh, my apologies. So I wanted to let you know they do actually have names. They're called Florks, Florks.
And I'm sorry, what does that name refer to again?
The drawings with the little sock puppet looking thing.
Oh, okay.
Florks. Yeah, they're called Florks.
I didn't know that. All right. Thanks for that. Okay. Next updates. Just to highlight on it. I haven't seen anybody do a numerical analysis of when vehicles are added to the BDA assessments, whether that's Oryx or War Spotting. I haven't seen a breakdown of an estimate of the recoverability of those systems, but as more Western systems are taking damage, we're getting some closer looks at the types of damage that they're sustaining. I don't know if that's because folks are more interested in Western systems, or maybe it's easier, they're rarer and therefore it's easier to try to count them. But whatever it is, a lot of these videos that are coming out, people are, who have experience maintaining the systems say, yes, it might be a significant repair, but this vehicle is not a write-off. It can definitely be repaired. So just as an example of that, the fifth item back in the nest, the tweet by OSINT Technical, it's a Leopard that apparently lost a track and a road wheel, and that it's recoverable, in the estimation of some people in the replies who say they've worked on these systems before. And I put that up partly because the sixth item back in the nest is there was an announcement of the opening of a new repair center, I believe including for Leopards in Poland. Excuse me. The version of the tweet that I chose to put up, like if you just want the generic information, click on that tweet and sort of scroll up in the thread. What caught my attention in the thread was OSINT Technical also highlighted that in their publication or PR of the opening of the repair center, they specifically included shots of the front of it. And he thought that was interesting. I assume his interest is out of a concern for OPSEC, in that this may be a signal of Poland or other allies essentially saying, yeah, we'll show you where we're taking the equipment and we're repairing it in Poland right here, and this is it, and what are you going to do about it? And at least that's my interpretation, that they're not hiding either the fact of it or particularly concerned about strikes against it. Go ahead, Exit.
Kind of follow on to that, when the Rheinmetall release about their factory that they're planning to do in Ukraine had mentioned specifically that they would protect that factory with their own AD. And I would be interested to know what protections this particular factory has or does not have. Go ahead.
Go ahead, John.
Thank you. I suspect that particular comment from Rheinmetall's CEO was probably bluster to some extent. The air defense component of it specifically. Rheinmetall manufactures the Skynex system, which is a gun-based SHORAD, well, mainly really close to the CRAM with some SHORAD capability system. Obviously, they have Gepard, but that's not production. So I assume it's probably referring to either of those. As for EEST SL, I cannot remember off the top of my head if Rheinmetall is involved in producing that system, because I think the primary contractor for that is Deals, not Rheinmetall.
Rheinmetall's not involved in EEST in any way, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, thank you, Colby. Yeah, so I assume they're probably referring to either Skynex or Gepard, and even then I'd take that as bluster. It will probably just be, primary protection will be provided by existing Ukrainian air defense capabilities. And the thing that I think is important that people should keep in mind is that manufacturing infrastructure is extremely difficult to destroy kinetically. It's much, much harder than people think. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, you are typically dealing with very large buildings where you don't know where specific items and infrastructure are located inside of said buildings. So your large buildings that requires multiple munitions, even if you hit the building, you're not guaranteed to destroy what's inside of it. And even if you do destroy what's inside of it, modern manufacturing equipment is much less specialized and a lot more flexible, especially, computer numerical controlled manufacturing machines, all the various machine tooling. It's far more flexible, and you can produce a much wider range of products with kind of just a single set versus, kind of historically the level of specializations that was needed for machine tooling, jigs, and manufacturing equipment. So the value of that plant is mainly in the human capital, the people that work there. And as difficult as it already is to destroy the infrastructure inside of those buildings, it's usually even harder to kill the people working there. So even if the Russians manage to hit this plant, it probably won't be offline for very long.
certainly the Rheinmetall plant in Ukraine we want protected. I would say even more so this new repair plant in Poland. We certainly hope Russia doesn't take a shot. Okay, thanks for that, guys. Moving on in updates, a couple of updates on Wagner and developments there. Having a look at the Nest, they continue to consolidate Wagner forces at this Belarusian camp. The first item is a tweet. Well, I think 4 out of 5 in this block are all from the Belarusian Hagen project because they do such good work. Several people, New York Times and others, have been looking at satellite imagery of the base as the population has built up there, tracking vehicle numbers and so on. I find it interesting that the Belarusian Hagen project in the first tweet is not just tracking the aggregate, but they're actually tracking the individual convoys as they cross through Belarus to the base. So they're noting that this is now the 10th group of vehicles or 10th convoy to come through. And so I really like the idea that there are these Belarusians who are Belarusians who are, standing along the side of the road and making, a little tally of here are all the vehicles that are coming by, and that they're definitely keeping an eye on that, which is terrific work. The second item in the Nest includes that more aggregate work, like the satellite imagery. And you can see they created a graphic that shows the change, and you can see the change in concentration of vehicles. And, I'm sure if you wanted to take the time and do a count of vehicles and try to estimate, the number of bodies that could have been moved, it'll, start to add up. My understanding, it's now in the several hundreds, given the camp was estimated to have capacity for 5,000 or 6,000. I don't think they're anywhere near that number yet, but it seems like it's an ongoing concentration of Wagner forces. And we'll just see if they can build up toward that max number. The third item back is the George Barros, who's, I believe he's a senior analyst for the Institute for the Study of War. And they're continuing to monitor Wagner's involvement in the country. So you can see marked on the map, it's not only the camp that they're consolidating at, but that they have also been spotted a little further to the south in Belarus, engaged in training at a Belarusian military camp. And hopefully ISW will keep their eye on this in the event that they get involved in other locations. The fourth item back is a note. It was observed that Prigozhin has now registered a new company, again in the Asipovichi district, which I believe is that southern region in the ISW map where the Belarusian military base is located. And apparently the company is named the Concord Management and Consulting LLC, which is quite similar to the Russian Concord company that Prigozhin had until recently. So it seems like he's just recreating that structure. So let me see. I think I have 2 more in this block. I do. So the fifth item back is a new legislative development where Lukashenko, as president, I guess he must have retained this power to himself, but that he has now given power to the People's Assembly in order to approve changes to military doctrine, to impose states of emergency or martial law, and to send Belarusian servicemen to other countries. All of which is delegation that might be necessary before military action. It doesn't mean military action is imminent, but it's worth keeping an eye on these sorts of changes in command authority. So I like to keep my eye on those as well. The sixth item back is an interesting article. This flows more from the fallout of the Wagner revolt. So this is not specific to their engagement in Belarus. But this article from The Insider, posted by Ambassador Daniel Fried, purports to have some sources who are in the FSB who are discussing the role of intelligence or perhaps not role in the revolt, but their response to it and their views on it. And so it's fairly rare that you see an article claiming to have access to intel-based sources, but that's what this claims. So do check that article out if you're interested. It sounds like the sources are suggesting that there were many who were sympathetic to Wagner in undertaking that revolt, and it's likely that there are some who would be open to supporting another effort or an effort along similar lines. All of which is doesn't bode well for the stability of the Kremlin regime. The next block I wanted to talk about are some comments that have been made that are a little bit provocative, all of which refer to Poland in one way or another. So they'll appear in the nest in just a moment. The first of which is video from a meeting between Lukashenko and Putin that was held, I believe, just yesterday. That one hasn't shown up yet for me, but it should for you in a moment. And so there's a video there where Lukashenko made some pretty inflammatory comments, talking about, well, Wagner's here and they're essentially keen for a field trip, and talked about making a trip across the Polish border toward Warsaw. And apparently he shared a map with Putin that, appeared to show plans for offensive action across into Polish territory. Now, a lot of people are saying that Lukashenko is trolling here and he's trying to stir up NATO, I guess we'll call them adversaries of Belarus, with no real intention of following through. But given that he does it in front of Putin, presumably there's some intended signaling here beyond just trolling. It's just a question of trying to figure out what it could be. However, similarly, it doesn't appear that it's just Lukashenko off the cuff in front of Putin, because the second item in the nest discusses how yesterday Putin had a meeting of his Security Council in which he went on a bit of a rant about the role of the relationship between Russia and some of the Central European powers, including Poland, where he talks about how many of Poland's Western territories were gifted to them by Stalin, which, is obviously an arguable point. Most would disagree with, but it begs the question, what is he going on about? Why is this suddenly a new issue? It seems to be a new line of argument. The third item back in the nest was, additional comments that seemed a bit aggressive, but they're sort of playing the reverse card. I spoke on Thursday about how they were, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, was trying to play Poland moving troops toward the border out of concern for Wagner's new presence there as aggressive, when of course the aggression is moving Wagner into Belarus in the first place. But in this case, Putin, the third item back in the nest, Putin said any aggression against Belarus will mean aggression against the Russian Federation, and Moscow will respond with all available means. So that's, essentially it's tying their fates together. And given Lukashenko's aggressive comments, you wonder what to make of it. The fourth item back is a tweet from Samuel Sharap, who I know people take issue with because he was saying that arms supplied to Ukraine at the beginning of the war would make no difference. He's not making an assertion here. He's asking a question, so hopefully you don't take too much issue with it. But he is saying the same thing that I thought, and so I like having a bit of analytical backup. He is saying that this Putin rant on Poland with his Security Council must be a set propaganda piece. It's very unlikely that Putin was just impromptu making those details up, that it would have been thought through in advance, and that it has a purpose. And that there are other channels in Russia, including some of these late night talk show hosts, who can be airing the controversial opinions. Soloviev does it all the time. So why would Putin say it himself at a Security Council meeting and then have it followed up with this rhetoric from Lukashenko. And so I don't have an answer, but I think it's significant enough to put on your guys' radar. So we'll just have to keep an eye on what's happening between Poland, Belarus, and Russia. Okay, I'm going to go into one more segment on Russian politics, particularly the arrest of Gherkin and some of the mill bloggers. Then I think what I'm going to do is, if you happen to be looking at the agenda, I'm going to jump ahead a few sections because I do want to get to the attack on Odessa and developments in the Black Sea, because we spent a fair bit of time discussing it last week, and there have been some developments that I think are worth covering before we wrap up. So if you just bear with me, I'm putting this bit of material on the arrest of the mill bloggers in the nest. The first of which is just coverage of the fact that Igor Gherkin, whose proper name is Strelkov, has been arrested. Apparently it was announced on Telegram by his wife, and you'll have that source in a moment. Several people highlighted the fact that in coverage of Gherkin's arrest, several of the big North American outlets described him as, a well-known critic of Kremlin policy, as opposed to starting with, war criminal and, military leader, which is his more appropriate description. But so they've taken their licks for deciding to almost downplay his role in their description of him. So the first item in the nest is the coverage from War Translated that discusses his arrest. And apparently he's been accused of extremism. We noted I included in the material for Thursday's conversation, if you search it for Strelkov associate arrested, a close associate of his was arrested Thursday, I want to say, so 2 days in advance, which led many people to speculate, well, if somebody that close to him and who was saying things no more extreme than Gherkin himself is saying, then he would likely be the next to be arrested. So there was a little bit of advanced warning this was likely to happen. So that first item is just a translation of the Telegram posting. The second item is the Telegram posting itself. Apparently after being arrested, the second item back is a post about an arrest of another associate of theirs, whose name is Pavel Gubarev, and he had been one of the leaders in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and similarly a member of the Angry Patriots Club, along with Gherkin. And apparently he was detained and then released. But it seems like that's now the third person, at least in that group of political commentators who have been at least detained. I haven't heard whether Gherkin has been released. I would assume he's still in custody since I haven't heard about it. But if anybody knows specifically, feel free to come up and let us know. The third item back is about a report that was written and leaked. So this is the thread by Chris Wiki. And in that particular report, they had called on the Kremlin to take repressive measures against those who are insane and those with whom it's impossible to negotiate. And so that's the language they were using to describe these folks that they're interacting with now. So, it's interesting insight to see the report that apparently was prepared several days in advance, and then they took action quickly. It's not clear, therefore, I don't know, maybe the process doesn't matter to you guys, but I would be curious about whether there were people who viewed Gherkin and his allies as a problem. They wrote a report and it just happened to strike a right chord in the Kremlin to say, okay, the moment's right. Or whether the Kremlin had decided they needed to do this, and then they commissioned a report in order to give some sort of independent evaluation As in, I don't know whether the leak of the report is actually a leak or whether it's intended for domestic political purposes to give some cover to a decision that had already been made. But that might be getting too down into the weeds. But do read that Chris O thread, the third item back in the nest, if you'd like to see a little bit more on that apparently leaked report. The fourth item back, on the late night talk shows, interestingly, they were discussing the arrests, and the sort of call at the populist level is that these folks should all be cleared out, and that the only things permitted to be done sort of on the social media level is the running of fundraisers, which is interesting that there are calls to essentially clear out the semi-independent analytical class. And I was thinking to myself how odd it would be, because if the tables were flipped, essentially we're the sorts who are engaged in the analysis and we'll call it like we see it. And so the sort of work that we're doing, I understand Gherkin and others are more political than what we tend to do. But this idea of the only engagement you can have on social media is fundraising would wipe out a lot of the, sort of Ukraine supportive analysis that we would do on Twitter. If you put yourself in the shoes of what if you lived in Russia, what would you be doing? The fifth item back in the nest is a profile. It's a report that was written. It's not specific to Igor Gherkin, although I believe he's referred to in it. The report is called, what was it? So it was prepared for.
And he's gone. We couldn't save him that time. I'm sure he'll be right back. I'll just take a quick minute to remind everybody. That didn't work, Mr. Bond. Do you want to test that again? I think he's resetting again. I'll take a minute to remind everybody that up in the nest is what we call it, which is directly above our heads. You'll find sources for everything that Mr. Bond talks about or that we talk about in here. We pretty much always try to get our sources so that you can find where we got the information that we're talking about. When we put things up in the nest, Planet is actually going through right now, and down in the bottom right hand corner is a little button, gives you the tweet for the space. You can tweet that out if you want people to come in and chat with us, but also we share in the replies each of those resources. So as you're going through for the rest of the week and you want to find more information, that's the place to go to find those sources. And one final note before Mr. Bond takes back over, if you do want to come up and chat with us, there's a button called Request Mic that is on the bottom left hand of your screen, and you can click that and we'll take a look and maybe bring you up.
Yeah, thanks for covering me there. I went to click on the link to that report just to refresh my memory on its name, and the app did not like that and crashed me. So the report will remain nameless, but it is that item. I believe it's the fifth back in the nest by Michael Weiss. I know it's like a 90-page report. It's something like the faces of evil or something like that. But it's a profile on those who were engaged in the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which includes background on Gherkin's activities. So it's hard to know what to make of all these arrests, whether the crackdowns are significant, sort of as people are still trying to determine the severity of the crackdown against Wagner after the revolt. It's not clear how reined in these mill bloggers will wind up being. But it is interesting that apparently the Kremlin has decided it needs to exert its authority against, several of these channels of what had seemed like they were independent criticism. Which means if you can't, sort of voice your criticisms publicly via one of these channels, you have to wonder whether that report I mentioned, written by The Insider, citing intel sources about those who would support further revolt action, revolutionary action, whether pressure will build up there if it can't find an outlet in the likes of Gherkin and other critics. Last item in this block, then we'll go on to the attacks on Odessa and the Black Sea. Sixth item back. This is just interesting. I said it in the context of these crackdowns. It's a tweet by Dr. Ian Garner, and he and several others have noted that in the last 2 weeks or so, Putin appears to have taken a different approach, where before people thought that he was very, germphobe, particularly after the COVID pandemic. And, they were talking about the long tables that Putin was set at and how people had to be tested. Now, whether it's Putin or a body double, you can debate that. That's fine. But that apparently Putin is going out into the public much more often and taking pictures with citizens. And this is the second or third event where he's done that, kissing babies, shaking hands, and so on. And so it's an interesting change. And again, you have to parse it. It will probably be just opinion at this point, but making a change suggests they feel like they must make a change, I think is the way to put it. Okay, so I do want to go on to events in the Black Sea. I think we'll start with the Black Sea items, and then we'll move into the attack on Odessa, and hopefully we can wrap that up in about half an hour, and we won't go too late. So I'm putting the items up now. We had a great conversation on Thursday night where, Sal Mercogliano joined us and John Conrad and, several other of our friends who are very interested in these events. But there have been updates. So the first, which should populate in the front of the nest in a moment, this is a report from the Kiev Independent. Several outlets covered it. Apparently, Zelensky has reached out to NATO. I think he spoke with Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, requesting that the NATO-Ukraine Council be convened. This is the new council that was promised at the Vilnius summit, that they be convened to discuss the Black Sea export issue. And some outlets, some have said that he spoke with them about NATO's assistance in continuing the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Others have characterized it more explicitly as having NATO protect the shipping lanes. But those two characterizations are different. And it's not clear that Zelensky's request went so far as for explicit protection, but perhaps more political backing. But, if anybody else has different opinions on any of these matters that I bring up, please just put your hand up and we can get into it. Stoltenberg, I didn't include it in the materials, but Zelensky put up a tweet saying, I spoke with Stoltenberg, although he doesn't say explicitly that they requested physical protection. And then Stoltenberg put up a tweet saying, I spoke with Zelensky and we're keen to speak with them to see how we can assist Ukraine. And it was a fairly neutral response that didn't seem, it wasn't an immediate endorsement of, we'd like to do all we can to keep the grain exports going. So given that neutral response, we'll have to wait for the meeting. Apparently it is scheduled for July 26th. So I think that's this coming Wednesday. Exit, go ahead.
I just was going to say, I think both of those, both the request and the response are exactly what you would expect them to be. I don't expect that anybody in NATO is going to go out on a limb unless they actually have to. And I expect that Zelensky will keep adding pressure until hopefully somebody does have to, or there is some other resolution that they can start shipping grain.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Unfortunately, though, it does seem like the existing infrastructure for the Black Sea deal is slowly fading away. So the second item in the nest, apparently Turkish defense sources are now saying that the Russian personnel have left the coordination center for the Black Sea Grain Initiative in Turkey, or in Istanbul, more specifically. And so if there was hope on the Russian side or an intention on the Russian side to negotiate, they might have kept those personnel in place. But it's looking like they don't have much intention to resume things anytime soon. Given that, we discussed on Thursday the exchange of Russia saying that they will treat any ships going to a Ukrainian port as potentially carrying weapons. And then Ukraine turned around and mirrored that and said they will treat any Russian ships traveling through the northeastern portion of the Black Sea as potentially carrying weapons. And then Russia came out and said that they reserve the right to perform inspections on Ukrainian ships. And so it's sort of relevant to take inventory of where different naval assets are. So the third item back in the nest is a tweet by M.T. Anderson, who does great work covering naval positioning in the Black Sea. He'll often look, every few days he'll put up satellite imagery showing what ships appear to be at which ports. And this is his summary on the current location of submarines in the Black Sea, noting that there are currently 5 of the 7 that had initially been based there. Exit, go ahead.
Just when we're talking about them possibly boarding ships and whatnot, it's very likely that if that were to happen, it would be helicopters that they're using to try and do that. And whether or not they actually have the ability to get that done, it wouldn't necessarily, it's unlikely to happen in places that are very close to the shore, because that would put them much more at risk, which really just leaves kind of the southern half of the international waters of the Black Sea. And to date, Russia has allowed Ukrainian ships to transit there consistently without causing any issues at all. So if they did change that action and change that course, it would definitely be a notable change in what's happening. I've talked to a lot of people. I personally think that would be a fairly big escalation. There's others who are quite educated on the matter who don't agree with me on that. So I guess take it or leave it on what you believe there. But it would be a change in the course of action for sure.
Well, thanks for that. As always, I appreciate, Exit, that you're keeping a close eye on this issue. I did put up another set of material. I'll get to that in a moment, but we'll go to Wolverine.
So as far as doing ship inspections, helicopter is not the only way. You can actually do it also via boat. And lots of times in a situation like that, you'd have the ship that is launching the boat very close enough, far enough away from hitting it, but close enough to where they can have their weapon systems trained on the ship, and then they can forcibly cause the boat to slow down. So you can do it either way. The other thing is it's going to be the real big issue is international waters is international waters. If they had even a Coast Guard ship out there, they can pull over a ship legally for whatever thing. But once this that you got to worry about is once they get within the 12 nautical miles of the Ukrainian coast, because that's basically part of their territory, 12 miles out. So it's one thing that, so that's what you got to watch and see. Are they going to do it out past the 12 miles, or are they going to do it within the 12 miles of the shoreline?
We'll see. Hopefully Russia doesn't actually wind up attempting any inspections, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, this next block, it's also related to the Black Sea. It's more context for background. So I'll highlight the resources. You might be interested in following up on them. The first item you'll see in the nest there, it's a report from Lloyd's List, which is one of the, I think it may be the largest maritime insurer. And they note that war risk apparently is still available for Ukraine, for ships traveling to Ukraine's Black Sea ports. So it hasn't been totally withdrawn. We did hear on Thursday that one company had suspended its product. I think that was Marsh, but that several of the other insurers have not suspended their products. But in this Lloyd's article, they are saying that even though the products remain available, apparently no one is signing up for them at the moment. I presume that's because the shipping companies themselves don't want to accept the risk given the uncertainties involved, which is, unfortunate. The hope would be that if insurers are still available, I mean, I don't know what has happened to the cost of the insurance rates, whether it's made it uneconomical or whether even given insurance, ship owners are not keen to act. But Exit may have knowledge of that.
So there's still grain for sale out of Odessa. There is still grain for sale out of some Russian-controlled ports, and there's still grain for sale out of the Ukrainian-controlled Danube ports. It is not my understanding that the ship owners are the ones who aren't necessarily willing to travel. It's more that the buyers aren't necessarily sure that they want to take that risk, because most of the contracts have changed to being kind of on a prepaid basis, and the buyers aren't sure that they want to take that at the moment. But there is absolutely war risk insurance available from Ascot of Lloyd's, and there's grain for sale, and there's people doing deals. It's just, there's also, there is also kind of a waiting game based on some ships who were contracted to go to Odessa before, and they had applied to be part of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It's not clear to me that those ships are necessarily released to kind of do whatever they would like to do, or that they have decided to sail. There's, I think, some moving parts in the background there that we don't know about publicly that are kind of stopping them from making some choices at the moment. They're kind of in a wait and see perspective right now.
So pretty well all the moving parts are still there. It's just there's enough uncertainty that people just aren't moving for the time being.
Yes, and I think that there are certain parties that have an interest in not challenging it while they continue negotiations, and that might be having an impact on what particular ships are doing at the moment.
Okay. So these next points, again, just background for the most part. Second item in the nest is a tweet from David McNair, and he goes into issues that are exacerbating hunger in different parts of the world over the last week. Lots of which relates to the grain deal, but I think we also made brief reference on Thursday to India restricting exports of rice other than one particular variety. I can't remember which it was permitted, but many rice exports. And so there are several items of downward pressure on food availability around the world this week. So you can see it set out in David's thread. The third item back, a tweet by Mike Lee, who's an agronomist who works with Ukrainian farmers and in the region. He came to speak with us a few months ago. And he has covered the news that Moldova is now offering quite a discount on transit for Ukrainian grain through their rail system. And so that they're offering a 40% discount. I just don't know what their capacity is like compared with other neighboring countries. But I suppose that every little bit helps. The fourth item back is reference to precedent on attempts to run blockades. We've discussed this in past spaces. It was suggested to me as a resource. This is with regard to the continued passage of oil tankers through the Iranian Gulf in the 80s and 90s, including while some ships were struck. And so this partly goes to that whole idea of Many of the moving parts, including war insurance, are still there. It's just people aren't choosing to act at the moment. And that it strikes me that the scenario still exists where, with insurance and with grain for sale, people could start attempting to run the blockade. And so this item has been pointed out to me as a precedent for that scenario to develop. The fifth item back is just, it's a figure put together by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, highlighting that the grain deal did not come to, it did not run smoothly and then end because it wasn't renewed, but that Russia had been slowly preventing the carrying out of inspections. It's something that Exit and others, mainly Exit, in our spaces had been highlighting for weeks because she had been doing the daily reports. And so some had been highlighting it, but apparently the message didn't get out to everyone. So that was the background. Next question, though, becomes what may happen next, particularly what are some scenarios for kinetic action? And so we talked about a few of those, the broad items on Thursday when we were speculating a little bit about, could Turkey provide escort? Could China, somebody suggested, could Chinese ships provide escort of Ukrainian grain exports? There was talk about, could a World Food Program ship go in? And so, all of those, I think, theoretically remain varying levels of probability, but some other ideas have come forward as well. And so, excuse me, the first item in the nest is just more context. I just had to fit it in this block, but it talks about the strategic significance of the Black Sea and why Russia is interested in it more broadly beyond simply controlling the trade, including the strategic significance for the ability to, land troops quickly in that flat Eastern European plain that makes them nervous. And so there are details in there about the strategic significance if you're not familiar with it. In terms of ships coming through, given the fact that Russia has said we'll treat Ukrainian ships as carrying arms, and Ukraine has said the same thing, vice versa. The second item back is MT Anderson posting part of his database of the transit of literal arms carrying ships, many of which he got satellite imagery of as they passed, and that in that satellite imagery, you can see the vehicles and weapon systems on the ships. So it's, they were not particularly being hidden. Most of these are the same familiar roll-on, roll-off ships, so you can see the rate at which Russia has just been openly. And because they're cargo ships, Turkey was not interdicting them in passing the straits. But if Russia is accusing Ukraine of importing arms, Russia is constantly importing arms, moving them back from Syria or moving them around from Kaliningrad or other territories through the Black Sea to the Ukrainian theater. So you can see that if Ukraine wanted to play the game of picking out ships that are transiting arms, they definitely have arms transiting ships that they could pick out. And these are known and tracked by satellite imagery. Go ahead, Exit.
It's not even just that they're known and tracked. Like, this has been going on since before the full-scale invasion. And like last summer, I think it was, we were talking about a ship per week type of activity that York was tracking through the Bosphorus. So it's consistent. They are transferring a lot of arms. It's surprising to me that nobody has targeted these ships beforehand, to be quite honest.
Yeah, I suppose it would be look, I'm not saying everything that's escalatory is unacceptable, but that it was likely viewed as unacceptably escalatory at the time. So that's not my judgment. That's me inferring that was others' judgment. We got a couple of hands popped up immediately. We'll go to Exit and then to Colby.
I don't disagree with you. However, I think we've seen many other escalations. And yeah, it's rather obvious to me that there's probably Ukraine is making choices like that based on external factors instead of what might be really useful for them particularly. That said, I will be the very first person to point out that commercial ships and cargo ships are not military targets, so please don't do that.
Colby, go ahead.
I would say that a civilian cargo ship that's carrying military equipment is very much a valid military target. I think the problem is that Ukraine does not have the means to destroy those targets because Russia can just stay well out of range out of Ukraine's available kinetic options to conduct such a strike. And there's not a whole lot that Ukraine can do. They have, ship-based, they have land-based cruise missiles, but they don't have, a very robust, large air force. They've got some drone capabilities, but none of these are particularly suitable to be reliably interdicting Russian ships out in international waters of the Black Sea. As I've previously stated, there's not parity in capabilities in the Black Sea domain. Russia has a very decisive advantage in this area. So Ukraine, just doesn't have the ability to interdict these ships, even if they made the decision to.
Which plays nicely into the next point in the nest, which is the third tweet back. So despite Ukraine saying that they reserve the right to treat Russian ships heading to the northeastern portion of the Black Sea as carrying arms, you can see in that third tweet back from Mike Lee, looking in just at the maritime trackers, that apparently Russian cargo traffic traveling back and forth toward the Sea of Azov and Novorossiysk and other ports continues as normal. So even though Ukraine has said we reserve the right to do this, it doesn't appear that Russian ships are adjusting their behavior or that Ukraine has made any attempt to interact with those ships. So that's the state of things at the moment. The fourth item back is one more scenario that we didn't discuss on Thursday. It's the tweet by H.I. Sutton, where he's saying, given Russia has said they may inspect ships, is there a risk that Russia may undertake an inspection, seize the ship, sail it back to port, and then claim that it was carrying arms in order to reinforce their narrative with no ability for independent double checking, which is partly why the UN was engaged in the Black Sea Grain Initiative in the first place, so that there would be a neutral party in participating in these inspections. So, who knows whether Russia will take that kind of a shot. But if they wanted to try to build a case in order to justify further escalatory action, potentially kinetically against a ship, this is the sort of thing that might be a precursor to that. And so since we hadn't covered it before, I thought it was an interesting idea. Okay, I just put up the last block on the connected directly with the grain deal. So we'll go to exit in a moment. We'll run through these grain deal items. Then I'll just discuss the attacks against Odessa in the last few days fairly quickly, and then we'll wrap. So we'll probably be another 10 to 15 minutes, just if you're setting, your plans. Exit, go ahead.
Just to your point about H.I. Sutton's post, it is almost certain that would be the most likely next escalation in the chain, because depending on the ship that you chose and the flags and all of those things, you could do it in a way that didn't piss off too many people and still kind of made your point that you were escalating and not happy with the ongoing situation. And specifically, I have said all along that if Ukraine is going to continue any form of import-export out, they need to be public about it, and they need to have inspections by an independent third party, somebody like Turkey or somebody like UN. And Ukraine has tried repeatedly to get commitments from both of those parties to continue those inspections. And that is a big holding point as to why they haven't continued with imports and exports, because or even just exports, because there isn't anybody willing to do those inspections at the moment.
Thanks for that additional detail. So this last block on the Black Sea grain initiative, or grain exports, we'll call it. First item in the nest, you'll see that Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, is making another trip to Africa. I believe if you check his profile, he just made his first stop meeting with senior representatives of the African Union. And so this follows other diplomatic efforts we highlighted recently, where they had African journalists visit the Ukrainian ports, and they had senior Ukrainian diplomats go to the United Nations. Now, I believe Kuleba had said this will be his third trip through Africa in the last year. So, they're clearly working hard both to express their interest in helping allies in Africa, and also to highlight the importance of Ukrainian grain. The second item in the nest, and this is going broader into what other ways are there to alleviate the problem. We mentioned a moment ago that Moldova is offering a discount on rail transit, sort of in keeping with that same idea. Before Croatia, Moldova offered the discount. The other day, Slovakia offered its rail system as a transit hub in order to bypass the countries that are a little bit prickly around. So Poland and other EU countries have limited imports from Ukraine. Now, Croatia, the second item in the nest, has offered to use its railways and ports in order to load ships on the Adriatic. And you'll see these two images. One is the rail network, and the other is the system of ports. So it's just more output potential. However, in order for grain to come from Ukraine into Croatia, it would have to cross either the territory of Serbia or Hungary. That neither Serbia nor Hungary has been particularly in a hurry to assist Ukraine. So it's not clear how seriously or how significant this input will be. But it may create conditions for additional pressure on Hungary/Serbia. I know there's a lot of displeasure with how they've acted, particularly Hungary holding things up in the European Union, and that there's, floating around talk of them being the basis for changing the European Union from a requiring unanimity for action. So we'll see what political pressure it generates. The third item back, also thinking laterally about ways to improve output. Schizo, our friend Schizo, who spoke with us about his thread earlier, highlighted that both in Canada and the United States, there are some considerable rail assets for transferring grain that are older. I guess they're apparently held as just, rolling stock. I'm not sure if it's a reserve, but suggesting that some of those could be transited to Europe in order to have more total throughput by rail. And on the surface, it doesn't sound like a bad idea. I'm sure that the cost to transfer all these rail cars, which are extremely heavy items, to Europe in volume might be an issue. It may complicate, if you have more stock on the rails, perhaps it complicates the logistics of routing. I'm not sure, but it sounded like a good enough idea to me. I thought I'd draw it to your attention. If you think it's a good idea and, we don't get anybody explaining why it's a bad one, who knows? Reach out to your representative, right? Like members of parliament and members of Congress might be, bored about hearing, maybe it's wrong to say so, but they may be so accustomed to hearing about you need to assist Ukraine in general from their constituents that saying to them specifically, you should assist Ukraine very specifically by having the government facilitate the transfer of these rail hoppers. That might break through the noise or they're being accustomed to just general ideas of support as opposed to specific ones. The fourth item back in the nest and last in the Black Sea topic is a tweet from Robin Brooks, who is an economist, and he notes that apparently 43% of all of Russian oil is shipped through the Black Sea, and that a huge proportion of that is on Greek tankers. And he's essentially making the argument, look, if Ukraine is closing the Black Sea to Ukrainian commerce, why are we allowing Russian commerce to continue? Like 43% of their oil is a huge amount of their revenue. There is absolutely leverage here to say, no, we're not permitting transit of, if Ukraine cannot transit commercial ships, Russia cannot transit commercial ships. And it's way more of a hit proportionally to Russia than it is to Ukraine. We have a couple of speakers coming up, so we'll give it a moment. So we'll go to CC first. Go ahead, CC.
I just happen to have the White House, if you want me to put it in the nest, the number that you can text to tell them about the rail cars. In order to contact your representative? Uh-huh.
Yeah, sure.
This one's for Joe Biden, but I have the rep number as well.
Sure, yeah. Feel free to put it up. Yeah, and we were also joined by Trent. Trent, go ahead.
I have a simple question for the group. I hear all about trains. I hear all about ships. I'm not hearing anything about grain barges. I mean, you can actually, there's barges you can go down rivers with, and if you've got a sufficiently large tug, you could tow a train of grain barges from Odessa to NATO coastal waters, hand off to a local ship that is not Ukrainian, and they can take the grain right the hell out of the Black Sea. And it doesn't seem to be an option that anyone has talked about. Has anyone have any knowledge? I mean, I'm sitting here using my Google foo, trying to find anything about the use of simple grain barges to how many are available, where are they? Can we being the supporters of Ukraine, in some way arrange that grain barges can be used as a bridge to get grain out of Odessa and into NATO waters, coastal waters, to be towed by a tug all the way out to the Mediterranean to wherever. It bothers me that this seemingly simple idea is not talked about. Over to you.
Thanks, Trent. We've been joined by a speaker called Maritime Journal, so he may have some input to that question. Go ahead.
First of all, the inland waterways in Europe are not, especially in the southern Europe, are not that much developed as we can see it on the Mississippi, for example. The barge trains are not so big, and the volumes carried are not so big. That's one issue, and the second is especially we in Europe we don't have well developed river sea barges. The ATBs able to operate both on big rivers and at sea are very limited in numbers. This is very small trade, so this is one of the issues. I also have a question to the group. Why the importance of Ukrainian grain is so often emphasized, is so loudly presented to the public, while during the whole period of Black Sea Grain Initiative operations, only 12% of tonnage of Ukrainian food, I mean grains and so on, grain and other food products, grain, I mean wheat, corn and others, only 12% of these of all Ukrainian export through ports associated with Black Sea Grain Initiative, only 12% went to African countries. So why is this importance of Ukrainian grain so much emphasized for Africa? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your detail on the dual river/sea barge availability. That may cue some listeners to go and try and dig into that to understand it further. With regard to your question about export to Africa, we'll go to Exit to answer.
I'll just try. There are barges that go from the Danube River ports to Constanta, and then they load that grain onto larger ships at Constanta and ship out of the Black Sea. It's not my understanding that those barges would be capable of going from Odessa down to Constanta or Istanbul or whatever. And I think the concern is that they would have the same risks that other larger ships would have, even if they're trying to stay closer to land. They still would be targets for the same sort of action from Russia. Regarding the 12%, it's actually 12.7% if we're going to be accurate about it. 12.7% of the grain from the Black Sea Grain Initiative went to Africa. Yes, that amount is not large. This year, a huge portion of that grain actually went through the World Food Program. This year, the World Food Program purchased 80% of their grain from Ukraine. So they were a large supporter of those particular programs from World Food Program and went to a lot of very food insecure people. However, that's not actually the big issue that we need to talk about. The Black Sea Grain Initiative opened up enough grain to the rest of the world that it dropped grain prices in general. So those countries and those people who didn't have very much money then could buy more grain with the small amount of money they had because grain prices had dropped. That's what's important about the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It doesn't really matter where all that grain goes as long as it's out on the market. When it's not out on the market, your supply and demand structure changes, your prices go up, and then ultimately the people who don't have money to pay aren't able to pay or have to pay more money for the small amount of grain that they can purchase. So opening it up is important because it floods the market with more grain, which we need in order to keep prices at a reasonable level for people with food security issues to be able to buy.
Well, also assumed in the question by Maritime Journal, when saying, why is it being presented to the public? Is it being presented to the public as only being important because of food availability to the global south versus many of us who are supporters of Ukraine for either personal reasons or for, ideological, you shouldn't invade your neighbors reasons, in which case it's not just the global south, it's also that farmers in Ukraine need to make money because it contributes to the Ukrainian economy, which contributes to the war effort. And so in that case, it doesn't really matter where the grain goes as long as Ukrainian farmers can find buyers for their product. So it highlighting the availability to poor countries assumes that the selling point is the benefit purely to those little countries as opposed to the benefit to Ukraine as well. And I don't think a lot of us here make that assumption.
If so, let me ask one more question. If so, if we support Ukraine, why the commercial ships with grain from Russia going through Black Sea, why this traffic is not stopped immediately? Part of grain shipped from Russian ports is cropped. Is taken from occupied Ukrainian areas. So part of grain exported by Russia is stolen from Ukraine. So why do the West, why do we allow these commercial vessels traffic from Russia through Turkish Straits to the world?
Sure. Fair question. Others are welcome to chime in, but I think it's a combination of tracking those ships and proving their origin, and not only the origin of the ship, but the origin of the grain carried by the ship is complicated in that Russia will assert that they are taking grain grown in Russian national territory, and they're just sending it to the ports on the Black Sea for export because it's cheaper transit, or they're taking efforts to hide the ships themselves by AIS spoofing or so on to make it more difficult. That's part of it. It's also that when you say, why don't we stop them? The question is who you mean by we. I don't think that Ukraine has the ability to interdict those ships. I don't think that the United Nations asserts that it has the authority. And the country that controls the straits is Turkey. And Turkey, as we've discussed in this space many times, has tried to play a middleman role. The question could equally be asked when we spoke about the transit of arms carrying ships, carrying Russian arms. Why weren't they stopped by Turkey? And it's sort of the same reason, in that Turkey hasn't wanted to play that role of enforcer, perhaps because they don't want to test the degree of authority that they have under the Montreux Convention, in that it's an old convention and not all the countries involved are signatories to it. And so it essentially may default to having to assert physical authority over the strait. And I think they would like to avoid that. But your question is a fair one about why isn't it being interdicted? And I suspect that there are plenty of people among us who would say, given the ability to do it, they would have been in favor of it. It's just, that's not the reality. We have one new speaker who's come up, so we'll go to Baza, and then I'll just go to my last topic, and hopefully we'll wrap by 7:30. Go ahead, Baza.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to mention most probably the best example of what they're trying to avoid with the grain going into Africa is what happened with the Arab Spring, where essentially you had grain prices go through the roof, and basically the average person on the street was struggling to feed their family, playing into that whole food insecurity issue. And I think with that also comes mass migration from Africa as well. So I think countries like Greece and Italy, there's a political dimension there. If they see any instability in North Africa, they know that they've got, additional problems that come about from things like grain prices going up, food insecurity, and I think this all plays into the picture as well.
I have no doubt that that's on the mind of some of these countries. It's interesting. Some of the same countries that are most concerned in Europe, that are most concerned with immigration, are the same countries that are limiting grain export through their territory. And so, on a country by country basis, they're balancing these issues, but you're probably right. That is one factor they take into account. Okay, so I'm going to move into the last block of updates, which is specifically the attack on the city of Odessa and the port, which, you know, I bring up at this point because I think it's connected partly with the ending of the Grain Initiative. Before going into that, I'll just point out the first two items in the nest. It seems like our crowd has grown a little bit. So for those of you who don't know our space, we run this space to cover the news, but then we try to draw a lot of information from open sources. You know, great open source accounts here on Twitter. We also try to present tools and techniques so that people can bring their skill up at interpreting or finding this information. And we present good work that others have already done so that you can, if you're interested in their type of work or you do the similar work, you can get together to collaborate a little bit. And we hold these discussions every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. This might be the appropriate time, though, to say that when I say every Sunday, I mean every Sunday except for next Sunday, which is July the 30th, when I will be away for vacation. So everybody, you know, it's the height of the summer, so everybody will get a well-deserved break. But we will be speaking on Thursday, and we'll then resume 1 week from Thursday at the beginning of August. So you can set your reminders now. And for those who don't know, the second item back in the nest. Caliber S-300, they're all in there. My understanding is that at least 5 or 6 different types of missile were used. It was quite a wide range. And several of those types of missile are extremely difficult for the air defense systems available in Odessa to intercept, particularly the Bastion anti-ship missiles. And I believe the Iskanders are very difficult to intercept as well. And so some of these strikes have been against port assets, including grain storage. We've discussed this in past spaces. Just last night, a missile struck an Orthodox cathedral. So that second item there is from Alexei Goncharenko. There are plenty of pictures that are going around about it, but Alexei posted a video of him walking through, so you can see the damage there. If you'd like some history on that cathedral, the third item down is from the Ukrainian Defense Department, noting that this particular cathedral was actually destroyed, I believe, by Stalin, and it was only rebuilt after Ukraine regained independence. It has actually been declared as a UNESCO, I believe, a World Heritage Site. And so further to my point about the types of missiles used, the fourth item down is a tweet from our friend Colby, and he's making the argument that since available air defenses cannot stop Bastion and 1 or 2 related types, apparently the Storm Shadow, because of its targeting system, isn't suitable to target mobile targets. And he's saying that offense would be the best defense in this case is to strike the launching locations, Storm Shadow is not an appropriate tool for this, but this would be sort of a perfect case for ATACMS. The variety of the missiles is highlighted in the 5th tweet from D. Mojavensis, P-800, the KH-22, which are anti-ship missiles, various cruise missiles. So they're, interestingly, he grudgingly says, I believe, that it's quite a, combined arms or coordinated fires, given that they're being launched from so many different sources. It seems like Russia is really putting a lot of effort into this sustained attack on Odessa. The 6th item down is Dmytro Kuleba, who's the foreign minister, who is making the assertion that the attacks against Orthodox churches have actually been done systematically, and that when Ukraine addresses the United Nations Security Council, they're going to make this point. And so I think this may be significant when we talk about war crimes, obviously an attack against civilians in general, but if the assertion is that they are intentionally targeting religious sites, that carries a slightly different quality to it that may strengthen the effectiveness of their appeal to the United Nations Security Council. Interestingly, so this is more outrage than anything, but down that thread, you see it says Russian commentator plans for Odessa, and this is Solovyev's show, where one of their analysts is essentially saying, well, should we save anything in Odessa? Should it be safe from attack? And one of their analysts says, no, save the opera house, but destroy everything else. And so while that's not the Kremlin's official position, I suspect it's not far off. But finally, I wanted to end on a more positive note. So you'll see that the last 2 items in that tweet on the attacks on Odessa are about the cleanup. And so almost immediately this morning, there's a video of people going in, taking away debris, sweeping up. Obviously, the damage is significant. There are some aerial shots that show the roof all around the dome is collapsed. So, it's open to the elements. But they're doing what they can right away. So that I think that shows a great spirit. And then finally, in that tweet is a link to a video showing that the church itself, they continued their services this morning, holding their mass or their service outdoors. And so I think that just shows the indomitability of the Ukrainian spirit, even in the face of these attacks. But we'll go to Colby, and we may have 1 or 2 more comments, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks. I just wanted to clarify that the problem with Storm Shadow is not its targeting, it's that subsonic cruise missiles are not sufficiently responsive enough to time-sensitive targets like mobile missile systems that can relocate after firing, and that'll be part of what I address in my thread on ATACMS. And the point about the joint fires with all the different missile types, that was actually my quote of Mojavensis's point about all the different missiles that are being utilized, whereas before it was usually just 1 or 2 different kinds, and now we have a much wider variety of different systems being employed in coordination, which I thought was kind of notable.
Yeah, I agree on the notoriety of it. And sorry, I didn't mean to mischaracterize your treatment of the targeting systems. I was a little brief, in sort of shorthand saying, I knew what you meant with targeting, that it's the timeliness of it. I just wasn't detailed enough in my description. And again, I look forward to that thread on ATACMS. So we'll go to Cece, and then I guess we'll probably give the last comment to Charles. Go ahead, Cece.
I just wanted to thank you for beginning, almost at the top of the hour. You've been going for so long. For the very prescient comment about all of us not being able to write each other right now, or many of us, because everyone's getting mad at each other. So I know that's not your normal fodder, but it was just so perfect to open with that, because everyone that's trying to keep up on updates and writing each other, we can't do it right now. So no one get mad at each other that you can't communicate currently because of Melon Husk.
Right. So you're referring to the limit on DMs in unverified accounts, like the non-Twitter blue. Yeah, that is an issue. I finally bit the bullet and paid for it when they rate limited, if only because I enjoy the work I do covering the matters in Ukraine. So it's not about, essentially it's I wanted to keep doing these spaces. And I thought, you know what, fine. If I have to pay $8 a month to keep doing these spaces, I'll do it. But I am kind of annoyed at the changes myself. Charles, why don't you finish us off with the last comments here?
Yeah, thank you very much for another great space, Michael. Just a short question, comment to exit. We're now looking at the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and I know we've discussed over the weeks in terms of what that might look like. We talked about attacks on the port of Odessa and Odessa itself. We've talked about blockade and all of these kinds of things. Looking at it now, exit, is any of this surprising to you? Are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic about the future? What are your thoughts?
I wouldn't call it surprising, no. I think that this is probably exactly where I thought we were going to get, but I am a little disappointed that we haven't had anybody else kind of challenge Russia's assertion that over the Black Sea. I think it's very dangerous that this is moving forward in lots of other locations. Countries try and make assertions over water. We watched Iran do this over the Strait of Hormuz repeatedly, and specifically now that we know Russia and Iran are working together so closely, and Russia is starting to really actively try and mirror those actions, it's interesting to me that we aren't seeing more actions from others. But I am very conscious of the fact that nobody wants World War III, and that there's a lot of people that think that that's where we would be headed if there was more action on this particular item. I think we're going to have a resolution, and I don't know what that will be. I think it's a little bit too soon to really be certain on that, but I don't know what the step forward is. I think Russia leaving the JCC this week probably put a point on the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative as it was, and it'll really now be about Ukraine convincing somebody to take a chance with a ship and actually get up there.
Okay. Well, let's all be hopeful that they make some kind of a breakthrough, or that there's progress made at the meeting between the NATO-Ukraine contact group on Wednesday. So I guess with that, we'll wrap up. I'm glad we got through most of the material. There were some economic items and diplomatic we skipped over in the middle. So do have a look at, if you click on the invite to the next space, the first tweet in the nest, it's all embedded in the same agenda. So you can go back and read all the sources that we discussed today, including those we missed. But with that, I think we'll wrap up. So I'll say thank you to everybody who came to listen. Thank you to all of our speakers. I think almost all of our speakers have been engaged in following the war in detail for quite a long time. I'd encourage you to check out their profiles and consider giving them a follow. And I will say thanks very much to my co-hosts, to Exit and to Radio and Nukes. I really appreciate your help. And without the help of this group, it would be very hard to hold these spaces. And so with that, I hope that you can join us all on Thursday night, and have a great evening.